Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the frozen mud of a medieval winter field where survival wasn't about cozy fireside feasts, it was about not starving before April. Picture this, you're a peasant farmer in 13th century England standing in your doorway at dawn in January. Your breath clouds the air. The ground outside is iron hard, crusted with frost that won't melt until noon, if at all. Your family is huddled around a fire made from dung and straw because you can't afford to burn wood every day. And somewhere in the back of your mind you're doing math, dark hungry math about whether the grain in your storage pit will last until the first harvest in June. Spoiler, it probably won't. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how global this little bedtime community has become. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Here's the thing about medieval winter farming that nobody tells you: it wasn't really farming at all. Winter was the season of waiting, rationing, repairing, and praying. You couldn't grow crops in frozen soil, you couldn't plough, you couldn't plant. What you could do was survive on the decisions you made back in September and October and hope desperately that you made the right calls. Because if you didn't stockpile enough grain, if your root cellar flooded, if disease killed your pig, if the winter dragged on 2 weeks longer than usual, you starved. Your children starved. Your neighbours starved. And the Lord whose land you worked, he'd still expect his rent come spring. Medieval farmers lived in a world where winter was a predator. Not the romantic snow globe kind of winter we fantasize about with mulled wine and Christmas markets. This was the kind of cold that crept through the cracks in your wattle and daub walls, that turned your stored turnips to mush, that made your fingers too numb to grip a tool. The kind of winter that killed. Historians estimate that in a bad year, say after a wet autumn that ruined the harvest, up to 10% of a village population might not make it to spring. Not from freezing to death, though, that happened. Mostly from malnutrition, from immune systems too weak to fight off pneumonia or dysentery, or the dozens of illnesses that thrived when bodies were running on empty. So how did they do it? How did medieval farmers grow food in winter without freezing to death? The answer is uncomfortable. They didn't grow much. They endured. They stretched. They gambled. And they leaned hard on every ounce of planning and improvisation they could muster. Let's talk about what that actually looked like day by cold, miserable day. First, understand that medieval agriculture was a high-stakes game of resource management that started months before the first frost. Your survival in January was determined by your sweat in August. By the time December rolled around, you were living off the consequences of every choice you'd made during the frantic harvest season. Did you thresh your grain fast enough before the rains came? Did you dig your storage pits deep enough to avoid frost penetration? Did you slaughter the right number of animals enough to preserve meat, but not so many that you'd have no breeding stock come spring? Every decision was a gamble, and winter was when you found out if you'd bet correctly. The medieval calendar divided the year into distinct agricultural phases, and winter, roughly November through March, was the dead season. Not because nothing happened, but because the primary work wasn't in the fields. It was in storage management, animal husbandry, equipment repair, and the slow grinding psychological battle against hunger and cold. You weren't idle, far from it. But your labour shifted from the offence of planting and growing to the defence of preserving and protecting. You became a steward of dwindling resources, a guardian of grain sacks and root vegetables, a mathematician calculating how many calories your family could consume per day without running out before the barley sprouted in May. And here's where it gets interesting. Medieval farmers were shockingly sophisticated about this. We tend to think of them as backward, superstitious, helpless against nature's whims. But these people developed crop rotation systems, bred cold hardy livestock, experimented with winter-planted grains, and built communal safety nets that would make modern preppers jealous. They weren't just surviving winter, they were engineering survival through centuries of accumulated trial error and hard-won agricultural wisdom passed down through generations. They knew things we've forgotten, like which wild plants stayed edible under snow, how to keep a pig alive on kitchen scraps and forest acorns, how to stretch a bushel of rye across 5 mouths for 4 months. But let's not romanticize it. Because for all their cleverness, for all their resilience, medieval winter was still a crucible that broke people. The historical record is full of chronicles describing the starving time, the lean weeks in late winter, when stores ran low and spring planting felt impossibly far away. February and March were the killers. That's when you'd already eaten your way through the best of your harvest, when the preserved meat was getting questionable, when you started eyeing the seed grain you were supposed to plant in April, and thinking terrible thoughts. So tonight we're going to walk through the whole brutal cycle. How the 3-field system kept land productive, how you stockpiled food across autumn, why you planted certain crops specifically to survive frost, what you fed your animals when grass was a distant memory, how communities shared resources to keep everyone alive, and what happened when all those strategies failed and famine came knocking. Because understanding medieval winter farming isn't just about agriculture, it's about understanding the razor's edge between survival and catastrophe that defined peasant life for centuries. You ready? Let's go back to a time when winter wasn't an inconvenience. It was an existential threat, and your shovel was a weapon against the void. You're standing at the edge of your village's fields in late October, watching a third of the ploughed land sit there doing absolutely nothing. No crops, no planting, just bare dark soil waiting for winter to bury it under frost and snow. And if you're a modern person suddenly dropped into this scene, you're probably thinking, this is a waste. We could be growing something here. Why is everyone just leaving it empty? Congratulations, you've just failed medieval farming. That empty field, it's the most important crop you're not growing. Welcome to the 3-field system, the agricultural innovation that kept medieval Europe fed and made winter survival mathematically possible. It sounds simple on paper. Divide your village's farmland into 3 big fields, rotate what you plant each year, and always leave one field fallow. But like most things that sound simple, the genius is in the details, and the details are what kept your family from starving when February rolled around and your grain stores were looking thin. Here's how it worked. Field 1 gets planted with winter wheat or rye. In October we'll get to why that matters in a bit. Field 2 gets planted with spring crops like barley, oats or peas when the ground thaws around March. Field 3 just sits there, all year, resting, recovering, doing the slow invisible work of rebuilding soil fertility while you try not to think about all the bread you could be growing there. Next year you rotate, Field 1 goes fallow, Field 2 gets winter crops, Field 3 gets spring planting. The year after that rotate again, around and around forever like a very slow agricultural Ferris wheel, where the prize for staying on is not dying. Now why would you intentionally leave a third of your arable land unplanted when you're one bad harvest away from famine? Because medieval farmers understood something we're only recently relearning. With modern industrial agriculture, soil gets tired. Every crop you pull from the ground takes nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium with it. Plant the same field year after year without rest, and eventually you're trying to grow wheat in what's basically dirt-flavoured dust. Your yields plummet. Your grain comes up stunted and weak, and suddenly you're facing winter with half the food you need. The fallow field wasn't wasted, it was healing. While it sat empty, several things happened. Wild plants and weeds grew up their roots, breaking up compacted soil and pulling nutrients from deep underground. Farmers would sometimes let livestock graze the fallow field, and here's the beautiful part: those animals were basically four-legged fertilizer factories. They'd eat the weeds, trample the ground, and shit nitrogen-rich manure directly into the soil. By the time that field came back into rotation, it was recharged, ready to produce strong yields again. It was a system that worked with nature's rhythms instead of trying to dominate them, which, let's be honest, medieval farmers couldn't have done even if they wanted to. They didn't have chemical fertilizers or industrial irrigation. They had cow dung, crop rotation, and prayers to Saint Isidore the farmer. But here's where winter survival enters the equation. That 3-field rotation meant you always had 2 fields producing food, one with winter-planted crops, one with spring-planted crops. You weren't putting all your eggs in one seasonal basket. If a late spring frost killed your barley in field 2, you still had rye from field 1 that had been growing since October. If autumn was too wet to get winter wheat in the ground properly, you could lean harder on spring planting. The system built in redundancy, and redundancy was the difference between "we're hungry but alive" and "we're eating the seed grain and probably doomed." Historians still argue whether the 3-field system was deliberately designed as a survival strategy, or just evolved through trial and error over generations. Probably both. Medieval farmers weren't sitting around theorizing about soil chemistry. They were noticing that fields got crappy after a few years of constant planting, and that letting them rest somehow made them better. They were empiricists, experimenters, working with high stakes and no room for sustained failure. And over centuries they refined the system into something remarkably efficient, given their technological limitations. Now let's talk about what happened on that fallow field during winter, because empty is misleading. Yes, you weren't growing food crops, but farmers used fallow land strategically. Some villages would collect the wild plants growing there, nettles, dandelions, wild garlic for soups and medicines. Others would turn pigs loose to forage, letting them root around for whatever they could find while simultaneously aerating the soil with their constant digging. The fallow field became a kind of communal resource, a space where the village's collective survival strategy could play out in small, unglamorous ways. And here's a quirky detail that rarely makes it into history books. Fallow fields were sometimes used for green manure crops. Farmers would plant something like clover or vetch, not to harvest but to grow part way, and then plough under while still green, mixing all that plant matter into the soil. It was a medieval compost strategy, turning living plants into fertilizer before they even matured. The practice wasn't universal. It took labour and seed you might not be able to spare, but in regions where they could manage it, green manuring supercharged that fallow field's recovery. The 3-field system also shaped village life in ways we don't often consider. Because everyone's fields rotated together, you couldn't just opt out and plant all your strips every year. It required communal coordination. Planting schedules, harvest times, fallow management. These were collective decisions made at village councils, enforced by custom, and sometimes by manorial lords who had their own economic interest in keeping the system running smoothly. Your winter survival wasn't just about your individual farm strips. It was tied to whether your entire village executed the rotation correctly. But let's not pretend the system was perfect. It was a compromise, a way to maintain soil fertility without modern inputs, but it meant accepting lower total productivity. You were always leaving a third of your land out of production, which in a world where more food equaled more security was a bitter pill to swallow. During periods of population pressure like the 13th century, when Europe's population was booming, That fallow field looked awfully tempting. Some villages experimented with reducing fallow time, planting more intensively, gambling that they could squeeze out extra yields before soil exhaustion caught up with them. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. And when it didn't, the village faced winter with depleted soil and insufficient stores, a double catastrophe. So as you stand there in October looking at that wasted field, you're actually looking at the foundation of your winter survival strategy. That empty ground is your insurance policy, your hedge against soil collapse, your guarantee that next year's harvest won't fail from overworked land. It's the agricultural equivalent of saving for retirement, painful to sacrifice now, essential for surviving later. Medieval farmers understood delayed gratification at a level most of us never have to consider. They left land empty so they could eat next year, and when winter came howling in, when the ground froze solid and the snow piled up against the walls, they rested a little easier, knowing that underneath all that ice their fields were quietly preparing to feed them again come spring. It's early September, and you wake up in darkness not because you want to, but because every single person in your village is already awake, and the sound of scythes being sharpened is cutting through the pre-dawn air like a collective alarm clock made of anxiety. This is it, harvest time. The next 4 to 6 weeks will determine whether you eat this winter or whether you spend February staring at your children's hungry faces and wondering which saint you pissed off. There's no snooze button on survival. You roll out of your straw mattress, pull on the same tunic you've worn for 3 days straight and head to the fields. The race is on. Here's the brutal math of medieval harvest season. You have maybe 30 to 40 days to cut, gather, thresh and store every single grain of wheat, barley, rye and oats that stands between you and starvation. That's it. Start too early, and the grain isn't ripe enough, you'll lose precious calories to underdeveloped kernels. Start too late and the autumn rains come turning your fields into mud and your grain into mouldy garbage. Wait even longer and the first frost hits, destroying everything overnight. So you watch the sky like a prophet, you check the grain heads daily, feeling them between your fingers for that perfect moment of ripeness. And the second they're ready, you attack those fields like your life depends on it. Because it does. The whole village turns out for harvest. Men, women, children, elderly folks who can barely walk, everyone has a job. The strongest men swing scythes in rhythmic lines, cutting wheat stalks in broad arcs that look almost meditative until you remember they've been doing this for 12 hours and their backs are screaming. Women and children follow behind, gathering the cut stalks into sheaves, binding them with twisted straw, stacking them into shocks to dry. Even kids as young as 5 or 6 are out there gleaning, picking up every dropped kernel from the ground, because in a world where 20 grains might mean the difference between a meal and hunger, nothing gets wasted. You work dawn to dusk, you work through blisters, you work through exhaustion, you work until your hands are so raw they crack and bleed into the grain you're handling. And here's what makes it even more stressful: you don't get to keep everything you harvest. A huge chunk of it, often a third, sometimes more, belongs to the lord whose land you're farming. That's your rent, your feudal obligation, the price of being a peasant. So before you can even think about feeding your own family through winter, you've got to set aside the lord's portion, deliver it to his barns, and hope you cut enough to satisfy both his steward's tally and your family's needs. Some years you manage, some years you don't. And some years the Lord decides he needs a little extra, because he's throwing a feast or funding a war or just because he can, and suddenly your winter margin evaporates. After cutting comes threshing, and threshing is where the real tedium lives. You've got these huge piles of dried grain sheaves, stalks bundled together, grain heads still attached, and you need to separate the edible seeds from the inedible straw, the medieval method. Hit it with sticks. Seriously. You spread the sheaves on a hard threshing floor, usually packed earth or stone, and you beat the hell out of them with flails, wooden tools designed to smash grain loose without pulverizing it into dust. It's mind-numbing, back-breaking, repetitive work. Whack, whack, whack for hours, days, weeks. And you do it inside a barn if you're lucky, because if it rains on your threshing floor, you've just ruined a significant portion of your winter food supply. Then there's winnowing, separating grain from chaff, the papery husks that stick to the seeds. The medieval technique was elegantly simple and infuriatingly weather-dependent. You toss the threshed mixture into the air on a windy day. The heavier grain falls straight down into your basket. The lighter chaff blows away. Repeat approximately 8,000 times until your arms feel like they're going to fall off. No wind, you wait. Too much wind. Your grain blows away along with the chaff. Just right wind. You work like a machine until every bushel is clean. It's agriculture as meteorological negotiation, and you don't get to reschedule if conditions aren't perfect. Here's a quirky detail that medieval sources actually record: harvest time was one of the few periods when peasants got to eat relatively well. Lords knew that underfed workers couldn't maintain the brutal pace harvest required, so they'd provide extra rations, bread, ale, sometimes even meat or cheese during those crucial weeks. It was pure pragmatism dressed up as generosity. A well-fed peasant could swing a scythe faster and longer. A starving peasant collapsed in the field and slowed everyone down. So you got your temporary harvest bonus, you ate better than you would for months afterward, and you used that caloric spike to fuel the labour that would determine whether you'd eat at all come January. But even with the extra food, harvest was dangerous. People died doing this work. Heart attacks from overexertion in the heat. Accidents with scythes. Those blades were sharp enough to sever a foot if you swung wrong. Hernias from lifting grain sacks. Infections from untreated cuts. And every injury, every day lost to illness or accident was food you didn't get stored before winter. There was no "I'll finish tomorrow" cushion. Tomorrow might bring rain, frost, disaster. You work through pain because stopping meant starving. Historians still argue whether medieval harvest yields were as low as some sources suggest. Estimates range from about 4 to 1 up to 10 to 1, meaning for every seed you planted, you got 4 to 10 seeds back at harvest. Compare that to modern industrial farming, which can hit yields of 30 to 1 or higher, and you start to understand the constant scarcity medieval farmers lived with. Even a good harvest left little margin for error. A great harvest meant you might have enough to sell some surplus and buy things you couldn't produce yourself, like iron tools or salt. A bad harvest meant you were eating your seed grain by March and facing next year with nothing to plant. And here's the psychological weight nobody talks about every September. You are harvesting the results of decisions you made months earlier, planted too early, too late. Wrong mix of crops, didn't weed enough. All those chickens came home to roost at harvest time. And there was no arguing with a sparse field of stunted wheat. It was done. This was what you had to work with. So you gathered every grain, stored it carefully, rationed it wisely, and prayed that your September fever of labour had earned you a winter where your children's bellies didn't ache every night. By the time October rolled around, and the last grain was safely stored, you were exhausted, probably injured, definitely thinner than you'd been a month ago. But you were also, if things went well, secured against winter. You had sacks of grain in your cottage, vegetables in your root cellar, grain stacked in the Lord's barns waiting to be ground into flour. You'd bought yourself survival. The gamble paid off. Until next September when you do it all over again. It's mid-October now and you're standing in your cottage yard with a shovel staring at a patch of ground near the back wall. Your neighbour's already digging his storage pit. You can hear the rhythmic chunk of his spade biting into earth, and you're doing the mental math one more time. Dig too shallow and the frost gets in, turning your turnips to mush and your onions to black slime by January. Dig too deep, and you hit groundwater, flooding everything, and losing your entire winter vegetable supply in one soggy disaster. Get it just right, though, and this hole in the ground becomes a time capsule of survival, an underground pantry that'll keep your family fed when the snow's piled 3 feet high and nothing grows for miles. Welcome to the unglamorous art of root cellaring, the storage technology that separated families who ate vegetables in February from families who got scurvy. Because here's the thing about medieval winter. You couldn't just wander down to a grocery store when you wanted carrots. If you didn't preserve your harvest properly, it rotted. And if it rotted, you didn't just lose a meal, you lost weeks or months of potential calories that you'd spent all summer growing. Storage wasn't an afterthought. It was survival infrastructure, and you built it with dirt, straw, and desperate hope. The basic root cellar design was brilliantly simple. You dug a pit about 4 to 6 feet deep enough to stay below the frost line, which in medieval England usually meant around 3 feet down, but smart farmers went deeper just to be safe. Then you lined the bottom with straw or dried grass to create a moisture barrier. Then came your vegetables, turnips, onions, carrots, parsnips, beets, anything that could handle cold storage. You layered them carefully, separating different vegetables with more straw, because some produce like onions gave off gases that could make other vegetables spoil faster. It was agricultural Tetris played with root vegetables, and the stakes were your family's winter nutrition. Once the pit was full, you covered everything with more straw, then a layer of earth to insulate against temperature swings. Some farmers added a wooden lid or stone slab on top to keep animals out. Rats, foxes, even desperate neighbours in famine years. You marked the spot carefully, because come January, when snow covered everything, you needed to remember exactly where you'd buried your food. Losing track of your root cellar was the medieval equivalent of forgetting your bank account password, except the consequence was starvation instead of minor inconvenience. But here's where it gets tricky. Storage pits were massive gambles against nature. Too much moisture and everything rotted into a fetid, unusable mess. Too little moisture and your vegetables dried out, becoming woody and inedible. Too warm and they'd start sprouting in December, using up their stored sugars and turning from food into garbage. Too cold and they'd freeze solid, not always fatal for root vegetables, but freeze-thaw cycles turn them to mush. You were trying to maintain this perfect microclimate underground, using Stone Age technology and vibes. No thermometers, no humidity gauges. Just experience, intuition, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of farmers who'd lost harvest to storage failures and learned from the mistakes. Different vegetables had different storage requirements, and medieval farmers knew this intimately. Turnips could handle near-freezing temperatures and actually got sweeter after a frost, something about cold converting their starches to sugars. Onions needed it drier, or they'd sprout and rot. Carrots lasted longest if you kept them barely moist, surrounded by sand or loose soil. Parsnips were champions. They could stay in the ground all winter, and you just dig them up as needed, assuming the ground didn't freeze so hard you couldn't get a shovel in. Cabbage could be stored in pits too, though it stank to high heaven if it started going bad, and one rotten cabbage could contaminate everything around it with its decay. Some wealthier peasants or minor gentry had actual cellars under their cottages, stone-lined pits accessed by a trapdoor, basically underground rooms where temperature stayed more stable than outdoor pits. These were luxury storage facilities, the medieval equivalent of having a sub-zero refrigerator. Most peasants made do with outdoor pits, multiple pits actually, because you didn't want all your food storage in one location. Lose one pit to flooding or rot, and you still had backup supplies. It was redundancy again, that same survival strategy we saw with the 3-field system. Never put all your eggs in one basket because baskets fail. Here's a detail that'll make you appreciate modern refrigeration. You couldn't just open your storage pit whenever you wanted something. Every time you exposed stored vegetables to air and temperature changes, you risked spoiling the whole batch. So you planned carefully. When you opened a pit, you took out a week's worth of vegetables, maybe 2 weeks' worth, if you could store them inside your cottage in a cold corner. Then you sealed the pit back up quickly, restoring that delicate underground climate you'd worked so hard to create. It required discipline. No midnight snack runs to the root cellar. No impulsive cooking decisions. You ate what you'd planned to eat rationed according to your calculations and hoped you'd calculated correctly. And then there were the rats. Oh, the rats. Medieval storage pits were all-you-can-eat buffets for rodents, and there was only so much you could do to keep them out. Some farmers buried ceramic pots in their pits, storing vegetables inside the pots for an extra layer of protection. Others used woven wicker baskets harder for rats to chew through than just straw. Some villages had communal cats whose entire purpose was patrolling storage areas and murdering rodents before they could devastate winter food supplies. A good mouser was genuinely valuable, worth feeding and sheltering because the grain and vegetables it protected far exceeded the cost of keeping it alive. Historians still argue about how much food medieval peasants actually managed to preserve versus how much they lost to spoilage pests and storage failures. Sources are sparse because, frankly, peasants didn't write dissertations about their root cellars, but we know from manorial records and chronicles that storage losses were significant. A bad storage year could turn a decent harvest into famine. Villages that seemed fine in October could be starving by March because their preservation methods failed. It was yet another variable in the endless equation of medieval survival, another roll of the dice that determined whether you'd make it to spring. So as you finish digging your pit in October, as you carefully layer in turnips and onions and parsnips, as you cover everything with straw and soil, and whisper a quick prayer to whatever saint handles root vegetables, you're doing something profound. You're trying to stop time. You're trying to keep August's abundance alive through January's scarcity. You're building a bridge between harvest and spring. And that bridge is a hole in the ground filled with hope dirt and things that used to be alive. It's late October, almost November, and you're doing something that looks completely insane to anyone who doesn't understand medieval agriculture. You're planting wheat, not in spring when any reasonable person would plant crops. Now, with winter breathing down your neck and frost already whitening the ground some mornings. Your neighbours are doing the same thing, scattering winter wheat seeds across freshly ploughed furrows, covering them with soil, and then essentially abandoning them to whatever the next 5 months might bring. Snow, ice, freezing rain, hungry birds, and yet come June. If everything goes right this October, planting will produce the best, most reliable grain harvest of the year. It's agricultural time travel, and it's one of the cleverest survival strategies medieval farmers ever developed. Winter wheat and its close cousin winter rye are weird plants with a weird life cycle that medieval farmers exploited brilliantly. Here's how it works. You plant the seeds in autumn October or early November, depending on your local climate. The seeds germinate quickly in soil that's still relatively warm from summer. Little green shoots poke up maybe 2 or 3 inches tall. They establish root systems sinking down into the earth like tiny anchors. And then winter comes and something remarkable happens. The plants go dormant. They stop growing. They just sleep. Buried under snow, exposed to killing frosts, seemingly dead. But they're not dead. They're waiting. This dormancy period, called vernalization, though medieval farmers didn't have that fancy term, is actually essential. Winter wheat needs prolonged cold exposure to trigger its flowering mechanism. Without spending weeks or months in near-freezing temperatures, the plant won't produce grain heads properly. It's evolved to sync its reproductive cycle with the seasons, and medieval farmers figured out how to exploit that evolutionary quirk. They didn't understand the biology, obviously. They just knew that wheat planted in autumn produced better yields than spring-planted wheat, and that was enough. Empiricism wins again. Come March, when temperatures start rising and the ground begins to thaw, those dormant wheat plants wake up. The roots are already established deep and strong from autumn growth. The plants explode into action, using the spring rains and lengthening days to shoot upward at a pace spring-planted crops can't match. By the time you're planting your spring barley in April, your winter wheat is already knee-high and heading toward maturity. By late June or early July, it's ready to harvest weeks or even months before spring grains ripen. And that timing difference, that's the gap between hunger and survival. Here's why winter wheat was so crucial for medieval winter survival. It gave you two separate harvest windows. Your winter wheat came in first, usually late June or July. Your spring grains, barley, oats, came in later August or September. That meant you weren't gambling everything on a single harvest period. If summer storms destroyed your spring crops, you still had winter wheat. If a late spring frost killed your winter wheat, you still had spring grains coming. It was diversification, agricultural insurance built into your planting calendar. And in a world where one bad harvest could mean famine, that insurance was invaluable. But planting winter wheat was absolutely a gamble, and medieval farmers knew it. Plant too early, say September, and the seeds germinate so vigorously that they grow too large before winter, making them more vulnerable to freeze damage. Plant too late, late November or December, and they don't have time to establish roots before the ground freezes, leaving them weak and likely to die. There was a sweet spot, usually a 2 to 3 week window in October, and you had to hit it. Miss that window and you'd either wasted seed or set yourself up for crop failure. Weather made everything uncertain. A mild winter was ideal, cold enough to trigger vernalization, but not so brutal that it killed the plants outright. But if you got an unusually harsh winter with temperatures dropping well below zero for extended periods or worse, repeated freeze-thaw cycles that heaved plants right out of the soil, you could lose the entire crop. Come spring, you'd walk out to fields that should have been green with wheat and find nothing. Dead brown stubble, wasted seed, wasted labor, and the sickening realization that you'd just lost your earliest and most reliable food source for next year. Medieval sources actually record these disasters. Chronicles mention years when the winter wheat perished in the cold, or frost destroyed the autumn sowing. When that happened, villages scrambled. You'd quickly plant more spring grain if you had spare seed, trying to make up the loss. But spring grains yielded less than winter wheat, and they came in later, extending the hungry gap between when your stored food ran out and when fresh harvest arrived. A failed winter wheat crop didn't just mean less food, it meant your survival timeline got tighter, your margin for error shrank even further. Now here's where winter rye enters the picture, and rye deserves its own appreciation. Rye was the working-class cousin of wheat, tougher, hardier, more bitter, less prestigious, but also far more cold-tolerant. Rye could survive temperatures that killed wheat. It could grow in poorer soils. It germinated more reliably in lousy conditions. For northern regions, Scandinavia, northern Germany, Poland, or for poor soil areas where wheat struggled winter, rye was the backbone crop. It made darker, denser, sourer bread than wheat, and the upper classes looked down on it. But rye kept millions of peasants alive through medieval winters, and historians still argue about whether Europe's population expansion in the High Middle Ages would have been possible without winter rye expanding the amount of land that could produce grain. Planting winter wheat also shaped your autumn work schedule. You couldn't just throw seeds randomly and hope. The field had to be ploughed first, back-breaking work even with an ox-drawn plough, then harrowed to break up clods and create a fine seedbed, then carefully seeded, either broadcast by hand or drilled in rows if you had the technology, then sometimes harrowed again to cover the seeds properly. All of this in October, when you were already exhausted from September's harvest, when you had a dozen other autumn tasks competing for your time. But you did it because June's bread depended on October's labour. And here's a quirky detail: some medieval farming manuals and folk calendars recommended planting winter wheat during specific saints' days or moon phases. Sow wheat on the feast of St. Luke, or plant when the moon is waning. Modern agronomists might roll their eyes at lunar planting calendars, but here's the thing: those traditional dates often corresponded with actual optimal planting windows for local climates. The folk wisdom worked even if the reasoning was wrapped in superstition. Medieval farmers were encoding real agricultural knowledge in religious and astronomical frameworks that helped them remember when to do what. So as you finish scattering those wheat seeds in October, as you watch the first green shoots emerge before the first real frost, you're making a bet on dormancy, on resilience, on the strange biology of plants that sleep through winter and wake up ravenous for spring. You're planting food in one season to harvest in another, collapsing time the only way medieval technology allowed. And when June comes, if you did everything right, if winter wasn't too harsh, if the gods or saints or simple luck smiled on you, you'll cut golden wheat from fields that spent 5 months under snow. That's not just farming, that's faith manifest in grain. It's December now, and you're standing in your cottage looking at your pig, a scrawny, bad-tempered animal that's been rooting around your yard since spring, and you're faced with the decision that's equal parts economic sentiment and survival calculus. Do you slaughter it now, turning 4 legs of walking calories into salted pork that'll last for months? Or do you keep it alive through winter, feeding it precious resources you might need yourself, gambling that it'll breed come spring and turn into 2 pigs or 3 or 4? This is an acute moral dilemma about farm animals. This is math written in meat, and your answer determines whether your family has protein in February, or whether you're eating nothing but grain mush until the world thaws. Welcome to medieval livestock management, where animals weren't pets. They were walking food insurance policies, and you kept them alive or killed them based on cold calculations about caloric return on investment. Every cow, pig, chicken, sheep and goat in your yard represented stored food that could either feed you now or potentially multiply itself if you waited. Medieval farmers lived in a constant state of resource negotiation with their livestock, and winter was when those negotiations got brutal. Let's start with pigs, because pigs were the peasant's best friend in ways that sound almost absurd. A pig would eat literally anything: kitchen scraps, spoiled grain, acorns, roots, insects, dead animals, possibly small children if you weren't watching closely. You didn't need to feed them premium food. You just needed to not starve them to death, and they'd convert garbage into bacon. They bred prolifically. A sow could produce 2 litters a year, 6 to 12 piglets per litter. And when you did slaughter them, every single part was usable. Meat, obviously, but also fat for cooking and light, skin for leather, intestines for sausage casings, blood for blood pudding, bones for tools and soup stock. A pig was a complete survival package that happened to be alive and oinking. But keeping a pig alive through winter required feeding it, and that's where the math got tricky. In autumn, you could turn pigs loose in forests to eat fallen acorns and beech nuts, a practice called pannage that was so economically important many medieval villages paid fees to local lords for the right to do it. Those autumn nuts fattened pigs beautifully, packing on the weight you'd later turn into preserved meat. But come winter, when the forest floor was frozen and barren, you had to feed them from your own stores. Kitchen scraps helped. Spoiled grain that wasn't fit for human consumption. Way left over from cheese making if you had a cow. But it all added up, and every handful of food that went to your pig was food that didn't go to your children. So November was slaughter season for pigs, and it was a village-wide event. Families would help each other butcher killing a pig properly, and processing it quickly before the meat spoiled required multiple people and specific skills. You'd stun the pig with a blow to the head, cut its throat to bleed it out, scald the carcass in boiling water to loosen the hair, scrape it clean, gut it, and then begin the long process of preservation. The choice of which pigs to slaughter and which to keep for breeding was agonizing. Kill too many, and you've got no breeding stock for next year. Keep too many alive, and you'll run out of food to feed them by February, and they'll starve anyway, wasting both the animal and the resources you spent keeping it alive. Cows were a different equation entirely. A cow was capital valuable in ways that transcended simple meat. A dairy cow gave you milk fresh in summer, preserved as cheese in winter, which meant protein, fat, and calories without killing the animal. It gave you calves which you could raise for meat or sell or trade. It produced manure, essential fertilizer for your fields. And if it was an ox, it could pull your plough, making it functional farm equipment. You didn't casually slaughter a cow the way you might a pig. Cows were investments you protected fiercely, even when food ran low. But cows needed feeding too, and winter was when cow ownership became expensive. In summer, cows grazed pasture. In winter, they ate hay-dried grass you'd cut and stored during summer. And hay takes up space. A single cow could easily consume 2,000 pounds of hay over a winter, and you needed to have cut, dried, and stored all of that before the first frost. Run out of hay in March and your cow starved, taking all its future value with it. Medieval farmers spent a huge portion of summer's labour cutting and storing hay specifically to keep livestock alive through winter. Chickens were the low-maintenance end of the livestock spectrum. They ate kitchen scraps, bug seeds, basically anything small enough to peck. They roosted in your cottage or in simple shelters using their own body heat to stay warm, and they gave you eggs, not as many in winter, because shorter daylight reduced laying, but some. An egg in January was a protein miracle, a perfect little package of fat and nutrition that didn't require killing the bird. Chickens were survival assets that paid dividends, and you kept them alive as long as they kept laying. Once they stopped into the pot, they went. Sheep existed in a weird middle ground. They gave you wool, which meant clothing and blankets and trade goods. They gave you milk, which you could turn into cheese. They gave you meat eventually. And they could survive winter on relatively little. They'd pour through snow to reach frozen grass supplemented with hay. But sheep were vulnerable. Harsh winters killed them easily. Wolves ate them. Disease ripped through flocks. If you had sheep, you worried about them constantly because losing your flock meant losing your clothing supply along with your food. Here's something medieval sources record that sounds almost heartbreaking. In severe winters, when fodder ran out, farmers would feed their livestock whatever they could find. Thatch pulled from their own roofs, boiled leather, tree bark, dried leaves. They'd slaughter animals strategically, feeding the remains to the survivors, a grim calculus where 4 starving animals became 3 adequately fed ones. And when things got truly desperate, they'd bleed animals, cutting them just enough to drain some blood for blood sausage or pudding, then bandaging the wound and hoping the animal survived. It was livestock vampirism, extracting food from animals without killing them, and it only happened when all other options were exhausted. Historians still argue about what percentage of livestock medieval villages managed to keep alive through winter, versus what percentage they slaughtered in autumn. It varied wildly by region, wealth, and weather. A wealthy manor might keep large herds alive on abundant stored hay. A poor village might slaughter nearly everything except essential breeding stock and dairy cows, gambling that they'd survive winter and rebuild herds from scratch come spring. There was no right answer, only locally adapted strategies developed through generations of trial, error, and hard-won experience. And here's the psychological weight every animal you owned represented decisions. Feed it, or eat its food yourself. Keep it alive for future value or slaughter it for immediate protein. Trade it for grain or hold on to it for breeding. Medieval peasants were constantly managing living assets with incomplete information, gambling against weather and disease and their own hunger. Those animals in your yard weren't just livestock, they were your retirement plan, your emergency fund, your insurance policy, and your burden, all rolled into creatures that needed feeding every single day. So as you stand there in December looking at your pig, you're weighing all of this, and whatever you decide, you'll live with the consequences until next December, when you'll stand in your yard again, making the same impossible calculations, playing the same survival game that never quite ends. It's the week before St. Martin's Day, November 11th, and your village is about to become a slaughterhouse. Not because of war or plague, but because of winter mathematics. You've spent the last few weeks watching your pigs, your geese, your extra chickens, calculating which ones will cost more to feed than they're worth alive. Now the decision is made. Today you kill, tomorrow you salt. For the next 6 months you'll eat the consequences of how well you preserve what dies today. Martimas slaughter was one of those medieval traditions that sounds quaint in history books, but was actually a calculated gamble against spoilage starvation and the brutal logistics of keeping meat edible without refrigeration. The timing wasn't arbitrary. Early November was cold enough that flies weren't a problem, but not so frozen that working outside was impossible. Animals had fattened on autumn forage, and critically you still had time before deep winter to properly cure and store meat. Wait until December, and the meat might freeze before you could salt it properly. Slaughter in October, and it was still too warm, bacteria would spoil everything. November was the Goldilocks zone, and every peasant family knew it. The village worked collectively on slaughter day because killing and processing a pig efficiently required multiple people and specific skills. One person to stun the animal, usually with a blow from a heavy mallet or the back of an axe. Another to cut the throat, precisely severing the major blood vessels so it bled out quickly. Someone to catch the blood in buckets, that blood was food, not waste. Others to haul boiling water from the communal fire, to scald the carcass, to scrape off bristles with knives or scrapers. The whole process had to move fast. A pig poorly butchered lost value. Contaminated meat could poison a family. This wasn't rustic charm, it was surgical strike homesteading where mistakes meant consequences. Once the pig was cleaned and gutted, the real work began: preservation. Because here's the thing about a dead pig in November, it's a race against decay. Bacteria don't care about your survival needs. They start decomposing meat immediately, and in medieval times you had exactly 3 preservation methods available: salting, smoking, and praying. Let's talk about salting first, because salt was the foundation of winter meat survival. Salt preservation worked by drawing moisture out of meat, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't thrive. You'd butcher your pig into manageable pieces: hams, shoulders, belly sections, loins. Then you'd pack them in salt, not sprinkle. Pack. You built layers: meat, then thick coats of coarse salt, then more meat, then more salt, like building a lasagna made of pork and sodium chloride. Some families used wooden barrels for this, layering salted meat with salt between each layer. Others used stone crocks, or even pits lined with wood. The goal was complete coverage, every surface touching salt, no air pockets where spoilage could start. But here's the expensive part: salt was costly. In inland medieval regions, far from the sea, salt was a luxury commodity that had to be purchased or traded for. A peasant family might spend a significant portion of their annual income on preservation salt. Coastal areas had it easier; they could evaporate seawater or gather salt from tidal flats. But if you lived in, say, the middle of France or Germany, salt was precious, which meant you rationed it carefully, using just enough to preserve your meat, but not so much that you wasted money. Undersalt your pork and it's spoiled. Oversalt it and you'd wasted resources you couldn't afford. It was yet another calculation with no room for error. After salting came smoking, the secondary preservation method that added both flavour and protective compounds. You'd hang your salted meat in a smokehouse, usually a small shed, or even just a corner of your cottage near the hearth, and expose it to slow cool smoke from burning hardwood. The smoke deposited antimicrobial compounds on the meat's surface and further dried it out. Good smoking took weeks. You wanted steady low-temperature smoke, hot enough to dry but not cook. Too much heat and you'd cook the outside while the inside stayed raw and prone to spoilage. Not enough smoke and you hadn't really protected it. Medieval farmers learned by failing, by tasting last year's mistakes and adjusting this year's technique. Different meats got different treatments. Bacon pork belly was heavily salted and sometimes smoked, creating those long slabs of preserved meat that could hang in your cottage for months. Hams were salt-cured, then aged, developing complex flavours as they slowly dried. Sausages were another strategy. You'd grind meat with salt and spices, stuff it into intestinal casings, then smoke or air-dry it. The grinding and seasoning helped preserve it, and the casing protected it from contamination. Every culture developed its own sausage traditions, different spices, different techniques. But the core logic was universal. Take meat that would spoil in days and transform it into something that might last until April. Now, let's talk about what preserved meat actually tasted like, because this is where medieval food gets real. Salt pork wasn't delicious, it was salty. Overwhelmingly, intensely, mouth-puckeringly salty. Before you could eat it, you had to soak it in water for hours or even days to leach out enough salt that it was palatable. Even then, it was tough, chewy, intensely flavoured. But in February, when fresh food was a distant memory, when you'd been eating grain mush for weeks, that salt pork was treasure. It added fat to your meals. It flavoured soups and stews. It was proof that something died in November to keep you alive in February, and you ate it with gratitude, even as your jaw ached from chewing. Historians still argue about how much meat medieval peasants actually ate. Chronicles and account books suggest it varied wildly by region, class, and year. A wealthy yeoman farmer might slaughter multiple pigs and preserve hundreds of pounds of meat. A poor cottager might have one pig or less, maybe shared ownership of a pig with neighbours. Some estimates suggest peasants ate meat once or twice a week in winter, though meat might mean a small chunk flavouring a big pot of vegetables and grain. Other sources suggest meat was rarer, reserved for feast days and Sundays. What's clear is that preserved meat was valuable enough to steal, and village bylaws frequently mention penalties for pork theft. And then there was spoilage, the nightmare scenario every family feared. You'd open a barrel in January and find that somehow, despite all your salt and care, the meat inside was rotting, green, slimy, reeking of decay. Maybe you didn't pack it right. Maybe you got a contaminated batch of salt. Maybe you just got unlucky. That spoiled meat represented calories you couldn't afford to lose labor-wasted money spent on salt for nothing. Some families tried to salvage partially spoiled meat by cutting away bad sections and resalting the rest. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it poisoned people. Medieval food safety was a lottery you played with your digestive system. Here's a grim detail that shows up in famine records when stored meat ran out early when February arrived and the last of the salt pork was gone. Families sometimes slaughtered their breeding stock, the animals they'd planned to keep alive for next year. It was eating your seed corn, sacrificing the future for the present. And it meant that even if you survived this winter next year, you'd have fewer animals, less meat, to preserve a smaller margin for survival. Famine could cascade across years, each winter eating the foundation of the next. So as November's slaughter day ends, as you hang the last sausages in your smokehouse and pack the final ham in salt, you're not just preserving meat. You're preserving time itself, holding on to November's abundance and trying to stretch it across the void. You're fighting entropy with sodium chloride and wood smoke. And when March comes, when you pull out that last chunk of bacon and taste the memory of autumn in every salty bite, you'll know exactly how fragile survival really is, and how much depends on the things you killed and salted when the leaves were still falling. It's January, and you're standing in your barn staring at a pile of hay that looked reassuringly large back in November, but now seems terrifyingly small. Your cow, the most valuable thing you own besides maybe your plough, is giving you that slow, patient stare that livestock have perfected over millennia. She needs to eat every day. Roughly 30 pounds of hay per day actually, plus water. You'll have to haul from a stream or, well, that might be frozen. And between now and April, when grass starts growing again, you need to keep her alive on whatever you managed to stockpile during last summer. Do the math wrong and your cow starves in March. Do it right and she'll give you milk, manure and calves for years to come. No pressure. Feeding livestock through medieval winter wasn't just labour, it was logistics, anxiety and creative desperation mixed into a daily routine that never stopped. Because while you could skip meals if you had to, your animals couldn't. A cow that didn't eat today wouldn't produce milk. A horse that got underfed couldn't pull a plough come spring. Chickens that went hungry stopped laying eggs. Every animal in your care was a dependent, a responsibility, a living investment that needed constant tending, even when you were exhausted, cold, and questioning every life choice that led to you owning livestock in the first place. Let's start with hay, because hay was the foundation of winter feeding for any grazing animal. Making hay sounds simple: cut grass dry, store it. But doing it right required perfect timing and decent weather. You cut hay in summer, usually June or July, when grass was mature but not yet gone to seed. You spread it in fields to dry for several days, turning it regularly so it dried evenly without moulding. Then you gathered it into haystacks or stored it in barns before rain ruined everything. Get it too wet and it moulded, becoming not just useless, but actually toxic. Mouldy hay could kill livestock. Get it too dry and it lost nutritional value, becoming basically crunchy cardboard that filled stomachs without providing calories. A single cow needed roughly 2,000 pounds of hay to make it through winter. Think about that. A ton of dried grass, cut, dried and stored by hand using scythes and pitchforks and raw human labour. Now multiply that by however many animals you had: cows, oxen, horses, sheep. A modest peasant household with one cow and a few sheep might need 3 or 4 tons of hay. Where did you store that much hay? In your barn if you had one, in a separate hayrick if you didn't. And how did you protect it from rain? Snow mice, spontaneous combustion. Yes, that's real. Improperly dried hay can catch fire from internal heat buildup and desperate neighbours whose own hay ran out. You built your haystack carefully, Thatched the top prayed a lot and checked it obsessively. But hay alone wasn't enough for all animals. Pigs couldn't survive on hay, they needed calories, protein stuff with actual food value. So you fed them kitchen scraps, vegetable peelings, spoiled grain, whey from cheese making. Anything edible that humans weren't eating went to the pigs. Some families kept designated slop buckets where all food waste accumulated, which sounds disgusting, until you remember that waste wasn't really a concept, everything got used. That apple core pig food, that bread too mouldy for humans pig food, that water you boiled vegetables in into the slop bucket. Nothing was truly garbage if something would eat it. Chickens were opportunistic omnivores, which made them easier to feed, but also meant you had to get creative. In summer they foraged bugs, seeds, grass, whatever. In winter, when foraging was impossible, you scattered grain for them. Not good grain. You wouldn't waste human-quality wheat on chickens, but damaged grain contaminated with weed seeds, the sweepings from the bottom of the grain barrel that went to chickens. They'd also eat scraps, small bones you'd boiled for soup, even each other if one chicken got injured and started bleeding. Chickens are tiny dinosaurs with zero ethics, and medieval farmers understood this and used it. Now here's where winter feeding got truly desperate forest foraging for livestock. When stored fodder ran low, farmers would let pigs loose in forests to root for acorns, beech nuts, anything edible under the snow. This was risky. Pigs could wander off, get killed by wolves, eat something poisonous. But acorns were legitimately good pig food, full of fats and carbohydrates. Beech nuts too. Some farmers would shake trees to knock down nuts, then herd pigs to the fallen bounty. It was free food, technically, if you ignored the labour and risk. Sheep and goats could browse, meaning they'd eat twigs, bark, dried leaves from trees. In winter, farmers would cut branches from willows, ash or elm and feed them to livestock. The animals would strip every leaf, chew the bark, and survive on what was essentially salad made of trees. It wasn't nutritious enough to thrive on, but it kept animals from starving when hay ran out. Pollarding, cutting trees at head height so they sprouted new branches year after year, was partly about managing wood supply, but also about creating browse fodder for winter livestock feeding. Here's a practice that shows up in medieval sources and sounds almost barbaric: bleeding animals for food during winter fodder shortages, then feeding those same animals more aggressively to help them recover. A farmer might drain a pint of blood from a cow, use it to make blood pudding or blood sausage for the family, then increase the cow's hay ration slightly to compensate for the loss. It was livestock resource extraction that didn't kill the animal, a way to get calories from your cow without slaughtering it. Historians still argue about how common this was versus how often it appeared in sources because it was unusual or noteworthy. But it happened, which tells you something about how desperate winter feeding could become. Water was another daily challenge nobody thinks about. Livestock need water, lots of it. Cows drink 10 to 20 gallons per day. But in winter, water sources froze. So you broke ice on ponds or hauled buckets from wells or melted snow, which took fuel and time. Some farmers let animals eat snow directly, but snow doesn't hydrate as efficiently as liquid water. Animals can actually become dehydrated eating snow, because melting it internally costs body heat and energy. So you hauled water every day in freezing temperatures, trying not to slip on ice while carrying a bucket that weighed 40 pounds. And then there's the community dimension of winter feeding. Not every family had enough fodder. Some ran out by February. When that happened, you had choices: slaughter animals early before they starved to death and the meat became worthless. Borrow hay from neighbours, a debt you'd repay next summer. Trade something valuable for fodder, or let your animals slowly starve, hoping spring came before they died. Village records sometimes mention fodder loans, or communal decisions about grazing rights on fallow fields where dried stubble might provide minimal forage. Winter feeding was partly individual responsibility, partly community resource management. Weather made everything uncertain. A harsh winter with heavy snow meant animals couldn't forage at all, increasing dependence on stored hay. An ice storm could make water impossible to access for days. A sudden January thaw followed by refreezing created ice crusts on snow that cut animals' legs when they tried to walk on pasture. Every weather event was a potential disaster for livestock management, and farmers had no forecasts, no warnings, just the sky, and their aching joints telling them what might be coming. So as you stand in your barn in January measuring out hay for your cow, you're performing a daily ritual of survival math. You're portioning resources, spreading scarcity across time, gambling that your calculations are right, and spring will come before the hay pile disappears. You're keeping alive an animal that's keeping you alive in a mutual dependency that's both beautiful and terrifying. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you're already thinking about next summer's hay harvest, about cutting more this year, about never wanting to feel this anxiety again, knowing perfectly well you'll feel it every winter for the rest of your life. It's February, the cruelest month, the starving time when your storage pits are running low and spring is still weeks away. You trudge out to your winter garden, if you can call it that, and stare at the frost-covered plants that somehow refuse to die despite temperatures that would kill most living things. Kale, cabbage, leeks. They're standing there like stubborn little soldiers, their leaves rimmed with ice, and you think, these bitter, tough, borderline inedible vegetables might be the only reason my family makes it to April. Welcome to the world of frost-proof greens, the medieval survival foods that didn't care about your comfort, they just kept you alive. Here's something modern grocery stores have made us forget. Not all vegetables die in winter. Most do, obviously. Your tomatoes, cucumbers, beans, anything tender and summer-loving, those are long gone by November, blackened by the first hard frost. But certain plants, particularly members of the brassica family, are basically unkillable. They evolved in cold climates. They laugh at frost. Some of them actually get sweeter after freezing because cold temperatures trigger the conversion of starches to sugars, a survival mechanism that medieval farmers noticed and exploited, even though they had no idea about the biochemistry involved. Kale was king of the winter garden, and if you've ever wondered why kale has such a weird reputation today simultaneously, a health food and a punchline, it's because kale has spent centuries being the thing people ate when they had no other options. Medieval kale wasn't the trendy massaged salad green you get at upscale cafes. It was tough, bitter, fibrous, the vegetable equivalent of eating a washcloth. But it grew through winter. You could plant it in late summer, and it would keep producing leaves straight through to spring, surviving frosts that dropped temperatures to 20 degrees or lower. You'd hack off the outer leaves as you needed them, and the plant would just keep growing from the center, an inexhaustible source of green matter when everything else was dead or stored. Cabbage was similar, cold, hardy, reliable, able to withstand serious frost. You'd plant cabbage in late summer, and by autumn you'd have dense heads that could either be harvested and stored in root cellars or left in the ground to harvest as needed through winter. Some farmers would pile straw or earth around cabbage plants for extra insulation, creating little protective mounds that kept the worst cold from reaching the core. You'd dig through snow to reach your cabbage, cut it free, brush off the ice, and haul it inside to thaw before cooking. It wasn't glamorous, but it was vitamin C fiber bulk for soups and stews, something green in a world of grey. Leeks and onions could overwinter too, their roots deep enough to survive ground frost, their tops dying back but the edible parts staying viable underground. You'd mark where you planted them stakes, stone something visible above snow and dig them up as needed, Frozen leek doesn't look appetizing, but once thawed and cooked it added flavour to the endless pots of grain and water mush that dominated winter diets. Onions stored well in root cellars, but some families left them in the ground, deliberately harvesting only what they needed, using the earth itself as a storage system. Now let's talk about what eating these winter greens actually involved, because medieval cooking wasn't gentle. You didn't lightly saute your kale with garlic and olive oil, you boiled it. For a long time, sometimes in the same pot you were making grain porridge in because fuel was precious, and you weren't wasting firewood on separate cooking processes. The result was soft, mushy, thoroughly cooked greens that had lost most of their texture and some of their nutrition, but also lost some of their bitterness, which mattered when you were eating kale 3 times a week for 4 months straight. Here's where medieval nutrition gets interesting in ways they didn't understand. Scurvy vitamin C deficiency was a genuine risk during long winters when fresh food disappeared. Symptoms included bleeding gums, loose teeth, weakness, skin problems, eventually death if untreated. But populations that ate brassicas through winter, even cooked brassicas, which lose some vitamin C in the cooking process, had enough residual vitamin C to avoid scurvy. They didn't know why vitamin C wasn't identified until the 20th century, but they knew empirically that eating greens helped that communities which ate only grain through winter got sick more often. Folk wisdom encoded nutritional science without understanding the mechanism. Medieval recipe collections, the few that survive, mention winter greens in terms that range from practical to resigned. When no other vegetables can be had, boil kale with bacon if you have it, or with salt if you don't. Not exactly enthusiastic endorsement, but recognition of reality. Some sources suggest mixing winter greens with grain to stretch both the greens' added bulk to porridge. The porridge made the greens more filling. It was food engineering driven by scarcity, every meal a mathematical exercise in making meagre supplies feel like enough. Historians still argue about how much fresh food medieval peasants actually consumed in winter, versus how much they relied on stored grains and preserved meat. Regional variation was huge. Coastal areas had different resources than inland regions. Wealthy households ate differently than poor cottagers, but evidence suggests that any household with a garden tried to keep some winter greens growing, because even wealthy people valued fresh vegetables in February. The difference was that wealthy people ate their winter kale as a side dish with roasted meat. Poor people ate winter kale as the main dish, maybe with a bit of grain or a scrap of bacon for flavour if they were lucky. There were other frost-tolerant plants people cultivated. Parsnips could stay in the ground all winter. Some gardeners claim they tasted better after frost, which is true because cold converts their starches to sugars. Carrots were more vulnerable, but could survive moderate frost with protection. Turnips, already a staple, could be harvested late and stored, but some could be left in the ground if the soil didn't freeze too hard. Root vegetables in general gave medieval gardeners options, ways to spread the harvest across the season, rather than gathering everything at once. And then there were wild greens foraged plants that grew in hedgerows and waste spaces even in winter. Chickweed stayed green under snow. Dandelions went dormant but could be dug up if you knew where to look. Nettles died back but could be found in protected spots. Wild garlic ramsons stayed viable in woods. Foraging for wild greens was supplement income for winter diets not reliable, but helpful, something to do on days when you were desperate for variety, or when stored food was running genuinely low. Medieval people knew their landscapes intimately, which ditches held watercress, which stone walls sheltered sorrel, which forests had wild onions. That knowledge was survival capital passed down through generations. Here's a detail that captures the desperation of late winter sources mentioned people eating tree bark boiled and ground into flour or porridge during famine years. Bark from elmash birch, not nutritious, but filling something to trick your stomach into feeling less empty. This wasn't normal. This was catastrophe, eating the things people turned to when real food was gone. But the fact that people knew which trees were edible and how to prepare them tells you something about how close to the edge medieval survival could get, how thin the margin was between normal winter hardship and outright famine. So as you stand in your frozen February garden, hacking half-frozen kale from plants that look dead but aren't, you're harvesting more than vegetables. You're harvesting the accumulated wisdom of centuries of winter survival. You're eating plants that don't care about your preferences, only about staying alive, and in staying alive, they're keeping you alive too. It's a transaction without sentiment, a partnership built on mutual stubbornness. And when April finally comes, when the first spring greens emerge and you can stop eating bitter frozen kale, you'll swear you never want to see kale again right up until next October, when you'll plant it all over again, because forgetting would mean starving. It's the dead of January, and you wake up to a world frozen so solid that the ground outside rings like iron when you tap it with your shovel. You wander over to where your plough sits, that heavy wooden beast that's been your constant companion from March through October, and you realise something both relieving and unsettling. There's absolutely nothing you can do with it. The soil is frozen 12 inches deep, hard as stone, impenetrable. You couldn't cut a furrow through this ground if your life depended on it, so the plough sits, and you find other work. Because medieval winter farming wasn't about farming at all, it was about maintenance, repair, preparation, and the endless small tasks that kept your agricultural life from collapsing. Let's be clear about something modern people often miss. Medieval farmers weren't lazy during winter. They just weren't farming, couldn't farm. The fundamental technology of agriculture, breaking soil, planting seeds, managing growing crops, was physically impossible when the ground was frozen solid and snow covered everything. So instead of fighting nature, they worked with the season. Winter became workshop time, repair time, the period when you fixed everything that broke during the frantic labour of spring, summer and autumn. You sharpened tools, mended equipment, cut wood, made repairs to buildings, processed flax into linen thread, carved wooden implements. Winter wasn't rest, it was different labour. Your plough, that critical piece of equipment, needed constant maintenance. Medieval ploughs weren't sophisticated machines. Most peasant ploughs were wooden, oak or ash for the frame iron, only for the ploughshare if you could afford it, which many couldn't. And wood breaks, splits, warps, weakens from moisture and stress. So winter was when you inspected every joint, every connection, looking for cracks or weaknesses. You'd replace broken beams, carve new handles if the old ones had splintered, secure bindings with fresh rope or leather straps. If you were wealthy enough to have an iron ploughshare, you'd check it for chips or bends, maybe trade with the village blacksmith for repairs. A broken plough in April meant you couldn't plant. A broken plough meant potential starvation. So you maintained it obsessively. Hand tools got the same treatment. Scythes, sickles, axes, hoes, spades, all the implements of agricultural labour needed sharpening, repairs, new handles. You'd sit by the fire on long winter evenings with a whetstone running blades across it, in rhythmic strokes creating the keen edge you'd need come harvest. A dull scythe made harvest twice as hard. A handle that broke mid-swing cost you hours of labour. So you invested winter time in tool maintenance trading, immediate comfort for future efficiency. Woodcutting was major winter work. You needed fuel wood for cooking fires, for heating if you were wealthy enough to afford that luxury. You needed timber for repairs. You needed stakes for fencing poles for construction, smaller branches for wattle in wall repairs. Winter, when the ground was too frozen to plough and trees had dropped their leaves, was ideal for cutting wood. You could see what you were doing. Frozen ground made it easier to haul heavy logs. And winter-cut wood with lower moisture content than summer, cut wood dried better for future use. So you bundled up, grabbed your axe and headed to the woods on any day that wasn't actively storming. But here's the complication. You couldn't just cut any wood anywhere. Most forests belonged to somebody, the local lord, the church, the king. Cutting timber without permission was theft punishable by fines or worse. So peasants had specific rights allowances for dead wood, fallen branches, certain trees marked for common use. You learned which trees you could legally touch and which would get you in trouble. You learned to recognize the subtle differences between "this dead branch is mine" and "this dead branch belongs to the Lord," and taking it risks punishment. Medieval forest law was complex, arbitrary, and strictly enforced because wood was wealth, and control of wood was control of survival resources. Inside the cottage there was endless work too. Threshing grain if you hadn't finished in autumn, that indoor work that filled winter days with the rhythmic thwack of flails hitting grain. Winnowing on windy days, repairing clothing, sewing patches, mending tears, spinning thread from wool or flax. Medieval clothing didn't wear out and get replaced. It wore out and got repaired until it was more patched than original fabric, and then it got repaired some more. A tunic might last decades with constant maintenance. Losing a garment to irreparable damage was a genuine economic setback. Women's work intensified in winter in ways that aren't always visible in historical records. Spinning thread, taking raw wool or flax and twisting it into usable thread, was constant winter labour. It could be done indoors by firelight, which made it perfect for dark winter evenings. It was also tedious, time-consuming, endless. The phrase spinster comes from this unmarried women whose primary economic contribution was spinning thread. That thread became fabric, which became clothing, blankets, sacks, all the textile goods a household needed. Medieval people spent an astonishing amount of time on textile production, because there was no industrial alternative. Every shirt on your back represented hours of someone's labour. Food processing continued through winter. Grain needed grinding into flour. If you had access to a watermill, you'd take grain there and pay a fee. If not, you ground it by hand using a quern, a small hand-powered stone mill that turned grain into flour through pure arm strength and monotony. Some families brewed ale in winter, a process that required specific temperatures and could be managed more easily indoors when you had control over heat. Ale wasn't just drinking for pleasure, it was calories safer than water, a dietary staple. Brewing was skilled work, typically women's work and essential to household survival. Socializing happened more in winter too, paradoxically. With less field work, there was time for communal gatherings. Village councils met to make agricultural decisions for the coming year, which fields would be fallow, when to plant, how to manage common resources. Religious feast days punctuated winter with moments of celebration. Community meals, church services. These weren't just social events, they were survival infrastructure, the ties that bound communities together and made collective survival possible. You helped your neighbour repair his roof not just out of kindness, but because next year you might need help, and maintaining those reciprocal relationships was as important as maintaining your plough. Historians still argue about how much free time medieval peasants had in winter. Some sources suggest winter was relatively leisurely compared to the brutal labour of harvest season. Other evidence suggests winter was filled with different labour that was just as constant if less physically demanding. The truth probably varies by individual, by region, by wealth. A wealthy peasant with well-maintained equipment and adequate supplies could probably afford some leisure. A poor cottager was scrambling constantly finding work making repairs with scavenged materials, trying to stretch inadequate resources across endless days. Here's what the sources do make clear medieval people understood seasons in ways we've largely forgotten. They knew winter was for preparation, not production. They knew you couldn't force the earth to cooperate before it was ready. So they worked with the season's constraints, finding productivity in maintenance rather than creation. They sharpened, repaired, prepared, and waited. And when March finally arrived, when the ground began to thaw and the first hints of spring appeared, they'd pick up that freshly maintained plough, hitch it to their freshly rested ox, and start the cycle again, knowing that next winter they'd be right back here, sharpening blades and mending handles and waiting for the earth to soften enough to break. It's late February, that awful stretch when your stored food is dangerously low and spring feels like a broken promise that'll never arrive. You've been eating grain porridge for weeks, maybe months, with occasional scraps of preserved meat if you're lucky. Your body is craving something, anything beyond the monotony of what's in your storage pit. So you do what humans have done for millennia. When cultivated food runs short, you go foraging. You bundle up, grab a basket, and head out into the frozen landscape looking for wild plants, berries, anything edible that nature hasn't killed yet. This is desperation botany survival, gleaning the knowledge that separates families who make it to April from families who don't. Hedgerows were medieval supermarkets if you knew how to read them. These dense tangles of shrubs, brambles, and small trees that divided fields and marked property boundaries weren't just fencing. They were food sources, medicine cabinets, and emergency rations growing along every farm boundary. Even in winter, hedgerows offered resources. Rosehips, the fruit of wild rose bushes, stayed on the plant well into winter, shriveled and frost-sweetened. You'd gather them by the handful, bring them home, boil them into a tart vitamin C-rich syrup or tea. Medieval people didn't know about vitamin C, but they knew rosehips helped with winter sickness. That people who drank rosehip tea seemed healthier than those who didn't. Hawthorn berries haws were another hedgerow staple. They hung on bare branches through early winter, small red fruits that were mealy and bland but edible. Not delicious. Not something you'd choose if you had options. But when your options were eat haws or stay hungry, you ate haws. You could cook them into a paste, mix them with grain to stretch your flour, or just eat them raw as a chewy, mildly sweet snack that tricked your stomach into feeling slightly less empty. Some families fermented haws into a weak alcoholic drink, because humans will ferment absolutely anything if it means making winter more bearable. Sloes, the fruit of blackthorn bushes, were similar. Intensely sour and astringent before frost, but after several hard freezes they became almost palatable. Almost is doing heavy work in that sentence. Sloes were still mouth-puckeringly tart, but that tartness meant they were probably nutritious acids often correlate with vitamins. You'd pick them when other options were exhausted, cook them with honey if you had honey, or just endure their bitterness if you didn't. Some villages made sloe wine a preservation method that turned borderline edible fruit into a drink that would keep for months. Acorns were technically edible, but required serious processing to be safe. Raw acorns contain tannins that are toxic in quantity. They'll make you sick, damage your liver, potentially kill you if you eat enough. But leach those tannins out, a process involving repeated soaking and boiling in changes of water, and acorns become a starchy, nutritious food that can be ground into flour. Some medieval communities did this routinely, especially in regions where grain was scarce. Others saved acorn processing for genuine famine, when you'd literally eat anything that wouldn't immediately poison you. It was labor-intensive, time-consuming, and the resulting flour was bitter even after leaching, but it was calories, and calories were survival. Tree bark, specifically the inner cambium layer of certain trees, was famine food in the truest sense. You stripped bark from trees like pine, elm, birch, or ash scraped away the tough outer layer and harvested the soft inner layer, basically tree phloem that carries nutrients. You could eat it raw if desperate, or more commonly dry it and grind it into a powder that you'd mix with grain flour to extend your dwindling supplies. Bark flour had almost no nutritional value, but it added bulk, made small amounts of real flour go further, tricked your stomach into feeling fuller than it was. Chronicles mention bark eating during severe famine years, and it's never described neutrally. It's always a marker of catastrophe, the line between "we're hungry" and "we're dying." Wild garlic ramsons grew in woods and damp places, and its leaves stayed green under snow in sheltered spots. If you knew where to look, you could dig through snow and find these pungent onion-flavoured leaves that added desperately needed flavour to bland winter meals. A handful of wild garlic turned porridge from flavourless grain mush to flavourless grain mush that at least tastes like something. It wasn't much, but flavour mattered when you'd been eating the same 3 foods for 4 months. Flavour was proof that the world still contained variety, that spring's abundance wasn't just a fever dream. Nettles were winter foragers' friends, though they'd sting your hands bloody if you weren't careful. Nettle patches in sheltered locations sometimes stayed partially green through winter. You'd wear gloves or wrap your hands in cloth, carefully pick the young leaves and bring them home to boil. Cooking destroyed the sting, and what remained was a green, spinach-like vegetable that was genuinely nutritious, high in iron, vitamins, protein for a plant. Medieval people valued nettles both as food and medicine, using them to treat everything from arthritis to baldness. Whether any of that worked is debatable, but the nutritional value was real. Here's where foraging got truly desperate lichen. Certain lichens, those crusty moss-like organisms that grow on rocks and trees, were technically edible after extensive processing. You'd soak them to remove bitter compounds, boil them multiple times, and end up with a gelatinous substance that could be added to soups or porridges. It was survival food in the most extreme sense, something you turned to when cultivated plant-stored food and preferred wild foods were all exhausted. Lichen eating appears in famine chronicles as a marker of absolute desperation, the edge of the edge, the thing people did right before they started dying. Historians still argue about how much medieval foraging was routine supplementation versus emergency response to crop failure. The answer probably varied enormously. In good years, foraging might be occasional supplementation, gathering nuts in autumn berries, in summer wild greens for variety. In bad years, foraging became primary food sourcing, with families spending entire days combing hedgerows and forests for anything remotely edible. Knowledge of edible wild plants was survival, capital passed down through generations, especially through women who traditionally handled food gathering and preparation. There were dangers in foraging beyond the obvious risk of eating something poisonous. Gathering in forests meant potential encounters with wild animals, wolves, boars. It meant trespassing on land where you might not have legal access, risking punishment if caught. It meant exposure to winter weather while you searched for food that might not exist. People got lost in storms while foraging, fell through ice on frozen ponds while gathering watercress, injured themselves climbing trees to reach nuts or fruits. Foraging wasn't a charming pastoral activity, it was risky labour driven by hunger. And here's the psychological weight that's hard to communicate when you're foraging in February, picking frozen rose hips from bare hedgerows, eating bark flour because your grain supplies are running low. You're not thinking about how connected you are to nature or how sustainable your lifestyle is. You're thinking about whether you'll make it to April. You're calculating days, counting calories, watching your children's ribs become visible through their skin, and wondering if you should have planted more, stored more, rationed better. Foraging in late winter wasn't empowering. It was terrifying, a daily confrontation with your own fragility, and the very real possibility that this year's spring might come too late. So as you walk the hedgerows in February's thin light basket, mostly empty hands numb with cold gathering rose hips one by one, because every single berry matters, you're performing an act that's equal parts hope and despair. You're refusing to give up. You're fighting for survival with whatever tools the landscape offers. And when you get home and boil those rose hips into tea and the tart, almost sweet flavour hit your tongue, you'll feel something complex gratitude for what nature provided, resentment that you need to rely on it, and bone-deep exhaustion from the endless grinding work of staying alive. It's Friday in the dead of winter, which means no meat today. Not because you're out of meat, though you might be, but because the church says so. Friday's a fast day, and fast days mean fish. And fish in medieval winter meant one of two things. You either had access to a stocked pond, or you were breaking ice on a frozen stream hoping something edible lived underneath. Welcome to the strange intersection of religious obligation and survival strategy, where piety and protein met in cold water, and where monastery fish ponds represented some of the most sophisticated aquaculture Europe wouldn't see again until the modern era. Let's start with why fish mattered so much in medieval winter. The church designated roughly a third of the year as fast days, all Fridays, Lent, Advent, various saints' days when eating meat from warm-blooded animals was forbidden. This wasn't optional, this was religious law, enforced by social pressure and sometimes actual penalties. But humans need protein, and winter was when you needed it most, when your body was burning calories just to stay warm. So fish became the loophole, the cold-blooded creatures that counted as not meat, in church logic. And medieval people got very, very good at producing, preserving and consuming fish, even when rivers were frozen solid. Monastery fish ponds were engineering marvels disguised as religious infrastructure. Monks who had to follow fast-day rules more strictly than lay people created elaborate pond systems where they raised carp, pike, tench and other freshwater fish. These weren't natural ponds. They were constructed, managed aquaculture systems with controlled water flow, regular feeding schedules and sophisticated breeding programs. A well-run monastery might have multiple ponds at different stages: breeding ponds, growing ponds, harvest ponds, cycling fish through a production system that ensured fresh fish year-round, even in winter. Carp was the superstar of medieval fish ponds. Carp are nearly indestructible. They survive in low-oxygen water, tolerate crowding, eat almost anything, grow reasonably fast and can overwinter under ice, as long as the pond doesn't freeze completely. They're also, let's be honest, not delicious. Carp are muddy-tasting, bony, the kind of fish you eat because it's available, and you need protein not because it's a culinary delight. But medieval people weren't choosing between carp and salmon. They were choosing between carp and no fish at all, and carp won that comparison every time. Here's how winter fish pond management worked starting in autumn. You'd feed your fish aggressively, fattening them up before cold weather slowed their metabolism. Some ponds were drained partially in late autumn to harvest a portion of fish for preserving, salting, smoking, drying, creating a winter fish supply that didn't require breaking ice. The remaining fish stayed in the pond through winter. Ice formed on the surface, but underneath in the deeper water fish entered a state of semi-dormancy, barely moving, barely eating, just surviving until spring thaw. When you needed fresh fish in January or February, you went to your pond with an axe or heavy pole and broke through the ice. Not easy. Ice could be 6 inches thick, sometimes more in severe winters. You'd hack and chip and finally create a hole large enough to fish through. Then you'd use nets or traps, or even just patient fishing with the line trying to catch sluggish winter fish that weren't particularly interested in moving. Sometimes you'd chum the water scatter food to attract fish to your hole. Sometimes you'd set traps days before and check them through maintained ice holes. It was cold, wet, miserable work, but it was protein, and on a Friday in Lent it was legally required protein. Rivers and streams were the poor person's fish source, and ice fishing in winter was part survival skill, part lottery. You'd find a spot where you knew fish congregated deep pools areas with underwater structures and cut through ice to reach the water below. You'd use simple gear lines with baited hooks or small nets or wicker traps weighted with stones. Fish in winter were lethargic, easy to catch if you could find them, but finding them was the trick. No sonar, no fish finders. Just knowledge passed down through generations about which spots held fish and which were barren. Pike were prized winter catches, aggressive predators that stayed active even in cold water. They were meaty, less bony than carp, genuinely tasty if prepared well. But pike lived in specific habitats and weren't as abundant as carp in managed ponds. Catching a pike in winter was a minor triumph, a break from the monotony of preserved fish and grain porridge. Eels were another winter option. They buried themselves in mud at the bottom of ponds and rivers when temperatures dropped, but you could sometimes dig them out if you knew where to look and were willing to get muddy and frozen in the process. Fish preservation for winter was its own specialized knowledge. Salting was standard layer fish with salt in barrels, the same method used for pork. Smoking worked too, hang fish in your smokehouse alongside meat. Drying was common in coastal areas, or places with consistent cold dry air. Split fish remove guts, hang them to desiccate into leathery, nearly imperishable protein. The North Sea herring trade was built on this, millions of preserved herring flowing inland every autumn, providing winter protein for populations far from the coast. Here's where it gets interesting from a social class perspective. Fresh fish in winter was luxury. If you had access to well-managed fish ponds, you could eat fresh fish even in February. That meant monasteries, wealthy manors, urban elites with connections to fish markets. Peasants ate preserved fish if they could afford it, or relied on their own ice fishing luck, or sometimes went without. Fish was theoretically the great equalizer on fast days. Everyone from king to peasant was supposed to skip meat. But the king ate fresh pike while the peasant ate salt herring so old and tough you could use it as a building material. Historians still argue about how strictly fast day rules were enforced among peasants. The church said no meat on Fridays and feast days, but did starving peasants in February really avoid eating their stored bacon because it was Friday? Some sources suggest flexibility. Necessity knows no law, and genuine hardship might excuse breaking fast rules. Other sources suggest strict compliance with social pressure and fear of sin keeping people in line even when hungry. The truth probably varied by region, by individual conscience, by how visible your eating was to neighbours who might judge. Medieval recipe collections include dozens of fish preparations clearly designed to make preserved fish palatable. Soak salt fish for days to remove some salt. Cook with strong spices, pepper, ginger, mustard to mask off flavours. Combine with grains to stretch limited fish across more meals. Make fish pottage essentially fish soup with vegetables and grain, where a small amount of fish flavoured a large pot of food. These weren't gourmet recipes, they were survival cooking ways to extract nutrition and flavour from ingredients that were often borderline appetizing at best. And then there's the experience of actually eating winter fish, which nobody talks about, but which shaped medieval people's relationship with food. Fresh carp from under ice tastes muddy. Salt herring that has been in a barrel for 4 months tastes overwhelmingly salty and fishy, with a texture somewhere between leather and wood. Smoked pike is better, but still intensely smoky, dense, chewy. You ate it because you had to, because the church required it, because you needed protein. And you probably didn't enjoy it much, but enjoyment wasn't really the point. Survival was the point. Compliance with religious law was the point. Making it to Saturday when you could eat meat again was the point. So as you stand by your frozen pond on a Friday in February, axe in hand, breaking through ice to reach the cold water below where sleepy carp are hovering, you're not just fishing. You're performing a religious obligation that's become a survival strategy, a weekly ritual that connects spiritual practice to nutritional need in ways that modern, separated lives have forgotten. You're extracting protein from frozen water because your religion and your body both demand it. And when you finally catch something, when you pull a sluggish carp through the ice hole and carry it home, you'll cook it and eat it. And probably not think much about how remarkable this whole system is, because remarkable or not, it's just what you do to make it through winter without starving or sinning. It's March now, that awful twilight month when winter should be ending but isn't, and you're standing in your cottage staring at your grain supply with the kind of sick dread usually reserved for watching something you love die slowly. You did the math back in November. You calculated carefully. You thought you had enough wheat, rye and barley to make it to the spring harvest in June. But it's only March, and you're already seeing the bottom of your grain sacks. The storage pit that looked so reassuringly full in December is now conspicuously empty, and you've got 3 more months, maybe 4 if spring comes late before fresh grain is available. So you do what medieval families did when stores ran low, you ration harder, you stretch further, and you start making terrible decisions about which mouths get fed first. Medieval grain rationing was mathematics written in hunger. A typical adult needed roughly 2 pounds of grain per day to maintain body weight and energy more if doing heavy labour, which most peasants were. A family of 5 needed 10 pounds of grain daily, which translates to about £300 per month, £900 to make it from January through March alone. Now factor in that you'd already been eating from your stores since October, that you needed grain for the entire winter, plus spring, and suddenly you're looking at a ton of grain, literally a ton, £2,000 as the minimum survival threshold for a small family. Get your autumn calculations wrong by even 10%, and by March you're in crisis. The first strategy was stretching, making grain go further by diluting it. Pure wheat bread was for the wealthy or for feast days. Everyday bread was mixed grain wheat cut with rye, barley, even oats or peas ground into flour. As supplies dwindled, the ratios shifted. More of the cheap grain, less of the good stuff. Then you started adding non-grain ingredients, ground dried peas, acorn flour if you'd prepared it chestnut flour in regions where chestnuts grew. Some families added sawdust, actual wood dust, to bread dough to increase bulk. It had no nutritional value, but it made a small amount of real flour feel like more tricking stomachs that didn't care about nutrition science, only about the sensation of fullness. Bread got smaller, thinner, denser. Medieval bread wasn't the fluffy stuff we know today. It was heavy, coarse, often barely leavened. But as March arrived and supplies dwindled, bread got worse. You'd bake loaves that were more like hard biscuits, dry and tough enough to last weeks without moulding, which mattered when you couldn't afford to bake frequently and waste fuel. Some families baked once a week, once every 2 weeks, rationing out pieces of increasingly stale bread that you'd soak in water or weak ale to make chewable. Porridge became the primary meal because it stretched grain further than bread. Take a handful of grain, oats, barley, whatever you had, boil it in a large pot of water or milk, if you had milk, and you'd get a pot of pottage that could feed more people than that same grain would as bread. Add vegetables from your root cellar if any remained. Add scraps of preserved meat if you could spare them. But as March wore on, pottage got thinner, more water than grain, a thin gruel that was barely nutritious, but at least hot and filling in the moment. Here's where the moral calculus got dark. Who eats what medieval families had to prioritise? The adult male who did heavy field labour at first and ate more because his strength was essential to next season's planting and survival. The wife who managed the household and prepared food ate second. Children ate what remained, with older children getting priority over younger ones because they were closer to productive age. Infants and toddlers, tragically, were often last in the feeding hierarchy during severe shortages. They were the most expendable from a cold survival standpoint, least invested labour, least immediate economic value, most replaceable if they died, and the family could have more children later. This isn't comfortable to talk about, but it's documented in crisis mortality records. Infant and child death rates spiked dramatically during late winter famines. Not because medieval parents didn't love their children, they did desperately, but because when you have to choose between feeding the farmer who will plant next year's crop or feeding the toddler who can't contribute labour, yet survival logic is brutal. Chronicles mention mothers giving their portions to children, starving themselves to keep kids alive. They mention families where everyone was slowly starving, but trying to keep the working adults functional. It was triage, not cruelty, but it was still terrible. By late March, some families faced the worst decision eating seed grain. Remember that you needed to save grain for spring planting wheat and rye, to sow in April barley and oats for later spring. That seed grain was sacrosanct, the foundation of next year's survival. But if you were starving now, next year's harvest was meaningless. So families started dipping into seed stores, eating the future to survive the present. Some did it strategically, taking a portion of seed grain, while leaving enough for a reduced planting. Others in desperation ate it all, which meant even if they survived a spring, they had nothing to plant, no way to produce next year's food. Eating seed grain created cascading famines. Villages that consumed their seed in spring 1315 had nothing to plant, which meant minimal harvest in autumn, 1315, which meant worse shortages in winter, 1316, which meant more seed grain consumption, worse harvests in 1316, and on and on. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 followed exactly this pattern across northern Europe, years of compounding failures where each winter's desperation ate the foundation of recovery. Historians estimate millions died not from single-season crop failure, but from multi-year collapse caused partly by seed grain consumption. Bread prices during shortage years tell the story in economic terms. Grain prices could double, triple increase tenfold during severe shortages. Urban workers who bought their grain rather than growing it faced impossible choices: spend all their wages on bread and have nothing for other necessities, or don't buy enough grain and starve. Crime rates spiked. Theft of food became epidemic. Desperate people raided storage barns, stole from neighbours, killed livestock they didn't own. Society frayed when hunger got severe enough because survival instinct overrode social cooperation. And then there was the physical experience of prolonged hunger, which medieval sources describe in haunting detail. Weakness, inability to work, constant cold because your body lacked fuel to maintain temperature, swollen bellies from malnutrition, sores that wouldn't heal, hair falling out, vision problems. Eventually, if the shortage went on long enough, the organ failure. Starvation is a slow death, and March was when it started claiming victims. People who'd made it through autumn, through Christmas, through February, only to die weeks before spring harvest could save them. But here's what's remarkable. Most years, most families made it. They calculated correctly, rationed, effectively stretched their grain just far enough. They reached April with supplies critically low but not gone. They reached May weak but alive, and when June finally arrived, when early wheat ripened and fresh grain became available, they'd eat like refugees, stuffing themselves on new bread, rebuilding depleted bodies, and swearing they'd be more careful with calculations next autumn. Until next March, when they'd stand in front of their dwindling grain sacks doing the same terrible math all over again. So as you stand there in your cottage in March counting what's left doing arithmetic that might determine whether your children eat next week, you're performing a ritual that's equal parts accounting and prayer. You're hoping spring comes early. You're hoping your calculations had enough margin for error. You're hoping that this year, unlike some years, you'll make it through. And underneath all that hope is the knowledge that plenty of families didn't make it, that grain shortages killed. That medieval winter was a yearly roulette where sometimes, despite your best efforts, you just lost. It's late February, and something remarkable is happening at the edge of your village, something that seems almost miraculous when you're used to everyone hoarding what little they have. Old William, 3 cottages down, ran out of grain last week. His calculations were off, or maybe he had bad luck, or maybe he's just elderly and alone and couldn't harvest enough last autumn, and instead of watching him starve, the village is quietly, collectively keeping him alive. A loaf of bread appears at his door. Someone accidentally makes too much pottage and brings him a bowl. The Lord's steward pretends not to notice when William gleans leftover grain from the manor's threshing floor. This is medieval community survival in action, the social infrastructure that meant the difference between we're all hungry and we're all dying. Welcome to the part of medieval winter that doesn't fit the popular narrative of brutal individualism and feudal oppression. Yes, medieval life was hard. Yes, lords extracted rents and peasants suffered. But at the village level, survival was fundamentally communal. You couldn't make it through winter alone. You needed neighbours who'd share their oven, their ox, their stored food when yours ran out. You needed social networks built on reciprocity obligation, and the shared understanding that this year you might help your neighbour, and next year they might save your life. The communal oven was infrastructure and social bond combined. Most peasant cottages didn't have proper ovens. They had open hearths for cooking pottage, but not enclosed ovens for baking bread. Ovens were expensive to build and maintain, requiring stone or brick construction skill to use properly and constant upkeep. So villages had communal ovens, sometimes owned by the lord who charged fees, sometimes cooperatively owned by villagers. You'd bring your risen dough to the communal oven on baking day, wait your turn and bake alongside neighbours. It was efficient. One large oven baking multiple families' bread used less fuel than individual ovens. But it was also social. Baking day was community time, news, sharing time, the place where information flowed and social bonds strengthened. Shared draft animals were another survival strategy. Oxen and horses for ploughing were expensive, most peasants couldn't afford their own, so they shared. You and 3 neighbours might jointly own an ox, scheduling when each family got to use it for ploughing, or you'd trade labour. I'll help you plough your strips if you let me use your ox for mine. These arrangements required coordination, trust, and community enforcement of agreements. Someone who refused to share resources or honour obligations got socially isolated, which in a medieval village was economic death. You needed your neighbours. Acting selfishly meant you'd find yourself without help when you desperately needed it. Grain storage presented interesting communal dynamics. Some villages had common grain stores, emergency reserves, that theoretically belonged to everyone, managed by village councils or church authorities. These were insurance against total crop failure, the reserve you'd tap when individual families' supplies ran out. But managing common stores was complicated. How much could individuals withdraw? Who decided distribution during shortages? What prevented people from taking more than their share? Villages developed elaborate rules, social pressures, sometimes religious frameworks to manage communal resources. It wasn't perfect. Grain theft from common stores appears frequently in medieval court records, but it existed a recognition that individual survival depended on collective planning. Gleaning rights were another communal survival mechanism. After harvest, after the Lord took his share and farmers gathered theirs, the fields were open for gleaning the poor. The elderly widows' children could walk the fields, picking up dropped grain kernels, cutting leftover stalks. The harvesters missed. It sounds meagre. How much food could you really get from gleaning? But for families on the economic edge, gleaning could mean the difference between near starvation and actual starvation. And villages enforced gleaning rights, protecting the poor's access to these marginal resources against enclosure by wealthy farmers who wanted every last kernel. Feast days during winter weren't just religious observance, they were community survival events. Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas, various saints' days, these occasions brought collective meals, shared food, temporary abundance in the middle of scarcity. The Lord might provide meat and ale for villagers. Wealthier families might host neighbours. Even poor families pooled resources to create something beyond their individual means. These feasts serve psychological purposes, breaking the monotony of winter, giving people something to anticipate. But they also redistributed food-moving resources from those with surplus to those without, wrapped in ritual and celebration, so it didn't feel like charity. Charitable obligation was deeply embedded in medieval Christianity and backed by social enforcement. The wealthy were supposed to give alms food, money, clothes to the poor. Monasteries ran almshouses providing meals to the destitute. Churches collected tithes partly to redistribute to those in need. This wasn't pure altruism. It was social insurance managed through religious institutions. The theology said helping the poor was spiritually necessary, but the practical effect was creating safety nets that caught people falling through economic cracks. Did it work perfectly? No. Were some people still desperately poor despite these systems? Absolutely. But the systems existed, which is more than you can say, for many historical periods. Labour sharing was constant and necessary. You'd help your neighbour repair his roof, and he'd help you cut wood. You'd watch someone's children while they foraged, and they'd share what they found. During harvest, entire villages worked collectively, moving from field to field, ensuring everyone got their crops in before weather destroyed them. These weren't formal contracts, but reciprocal obligations enforced by custom and necessity. Someone who refused to participate in communal labour found themselves excluded from receiving help, which in medieval agriculture meant probably starving. Here's where it gets complicated. Community support had limits and hierarchies. Villages helped their own people with established place in the community, family ties, reputation for reciprocity. Strangers, wanderers, people without social capital, they might be helped out of Christian charity, but they weren't part of the network. Social class mattered too. A struggling yeoman farmer got more community support than a landless labourer. Medieval community wasn't egalitarian utopia. It was practical, selective, based on calculations about who was worth investing in, who would reciprocate, who was one of us. Historians still argue about how much medieval community spirit was genuine altruism versus calculated self-interest. The truth is probably both inseparably mixed. You helped your neighbour because Christian morality said you should, yes, but also because you might need their help next year. Because reputation mattered and being known as selfish hurt your family's prospects. Because social cohesion made the whole village stronger, improving everyone's survival odds. The motives were complex, but the effects were real. Communities that cooperated survived better than those that didn't. And then there's what happened when community systems failed. Villages where cooperation broke down through internal conflicts, resource collapse, external pressures became disaster zones. Crime increased, violence flared, People abandoned their homes, becoming vagrants, hoping to find survival elsewhere. Chronicles from famine periods describe social breakdown, neighbours stealing from neighbours, families disintegrating, the complete erosion of the reciprocal networks that normally held communities together. It's a reminder that communal survival wasn't automatic. It required constant maintenance, constant reinforcement of social bonds that could fray quickly under pressure. So as you watch your village quietly keeping old William alive through February's harshest stretch, you're witnessing something profound. It's not just charity, it's social technology, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of collective survival, translated into small daily acts that knit communities together. It's people understanding bone deep that they're stronger together than apart, that the calories they share today might be the help they receive tomorrow. Medieval winter farming wasn't just about plants and animals and stored grain. It was about the social fabric that held people together when everything else was trying to tear them apart. And that fabric, woven from obligation and reciprocity and shared suffering, might be the most sophisticated technology medieval farmers ever developed. It's February 28th, and you're standing in your cottage doing arithmetic that makes your hands shake. You have maybe 3 weeks of grain left. Maybe 4 if you start rationing so severely that everyone's constantly dizzy with hunger. Spring planting starts in late March, early April, but harvest won't come until June at the earliest, 3.5 months away. The gap between when your food runs out and when new food becomes available is widening like a crack in ice, and you're realizing with sick certainty that you miscalculated. Your family isn't going to make it. Not on what you have. This is famine's creep, not the dramatic sudden disaster of plague or invasion, but the slow mathematical certainty that your numbers don't add up and people are going to suffer for it. Welcome to the thing medieval sources describe with real horror, the starving time, the hunger gap. Those awful weeks in late winter and early spring when stored food ran out, but fresh food wasn't available yet. This wasn't unusual. This was a recurring crisis that happened somewhere in Europe almost every year, affecting some villages, some regions, sometimes entire countries. And when it happened, when your calculations failed and your stores emptied, you faced a series of increasingly desperate choices, each one worse than the last. The first choice was eating things you'd planned to save. Seed grain, as we discussed, was supposed to be untouchable, that was next year's harvest. But when your children are crying with hunger, when you can see their ribs through their skin, when they're too weak to stand suddenly, next year's theoretical harvest matters less than this week's survival. So you start eating seed grain. Just a little at first. Just enough to get through another week. But once you start, it's hard to stop. Every handful of seed grain you eat is food. You won't plant harvest, you won't get a deeper hole you're digging. That'll make next winter even worse. But those are problems for future you. Present your needs to eat today. The second choice was slaughtering animals you'd planned to keep. Your cow that gives milk. Your breeding sow. Your ox that pulls the plough. These are capital infrastructure, your farm's productive capacity. Killing them is like burning your house for warmth. It works temporarily, but destroys your future. Yet when famine hit people, slaughtered breeding stock because meat now was more valuable than theoretical future productivity. Chronicles record this happening during severe famines villages where all the cattle were slaughtered, where no breeding animals remained, where recovery took years because the productive foundation had been consumed in desperation. Borrowing food was another option, but borrowing during famine meant you were competing with everyone else who was also short on supplies. Neighbours who might normally share weren't sharing because they were also hungry. Loans came with steep interest. You borrowed 1 sack of grain in March, you owed back 2 sacks after harvest. And if harvest failed again, you fell into debt you could never repay, eventually losing land freedom, sometimes selling yourself or family members into servitude to cover debts. Medieval debt records from famine periods show cascading failures, families borrowing to survive 1 year, unable to repay borrowing more the next year, eventually losing everything. Foraging intensified to desperate levels. Things you'd normally consider inedible tree bark, grassroots of questionable safety, became food sources. Medieval famine accounts mention people eating things that poisoned them, toxic plants they couldn't properly identify, spoiled food they ate anyway, substances that were technically edible but nutritionally worthless. People got sick. Some died from eating the wrong things, adding poisoning to starvation as causes of death. The knowledge gap between experienced forager who knows safe wild foods and desperate person eating anything green was literally life and death. Crime spiked during famine. Theft of food became epidemic. Grain stolen from storage barns, livestock rustled and butchered at night, bread stolen from ovens. Punishments for theft were severe: hanging, mutilation, public whipping. But when you're starving, the risk of punishment becomes acceptable compared to the certainty of death. Court records from famine years are full of food theft cases, often with tragic details: elderly people caught stealing a loaf of bread, children caught taking grain, parents stealing to feed families and facing execution for it. Begging became normalized during famine. People who'd been self-sufficient farmers found themselves at church doors asking for alms, walking village to village hoping for handouts. Roads filled with wandering, hungry people, displaced farmers, abandoned children. Entire families on the move looking for anywhere that had food. Some made it to cities where charitable institutions might help. Others died on the roads, bodies found in ditches come spring. Medieval famine wasn't just about people starving in place, it created mass movement, displacement, refugee crises that strained urban resources and spread disease. Disease followed famine like a shadow. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people vulnerable to infections that normally wouldn't kill. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. These opportunistic diseases thrived in malnourished populations living in crowded, unsanitary conditions. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 killed millions, but historians still argue about how many died from actual starvation versus from diseases that flourished because famine had weakened everyone. The two were inseparable. Famine created conditions where disease could rampage. Infanticide and abandonment appear in famine sources, though always described with horror. Parents who couldn't feed all their children sometimes abandoned infants at church doors, hoping monasteries would care for them. Sometimes they didn't, and those children died. Extremely rare cases mention infanticide, parents killing infants so older children might survive. These weren't common, but they happened, and the fact that sources mention them suggests they were real responses to impossible situations. Medieval morality condemned these acts absolutely, but famine created moral crises where all choices were terrible. Here's what's psychologically devastating about famine: it's visible. You watch your neighbours getting thinner. You see children with distended bellies, a symptom of severe malnutrition. You hear crying at night from hungry families. You attend funerals for people who died from what everyone knows is starvation, though it's usually recorded as weakness or fever, because acknowledging mass starvation reflects badly on community and authority. The social fabric starts tearing. People who are generous become hoarders. Communities that cooperated fragment into desperate individuals. Historians still argue about famine frequency in medieval Europe. Some estimates suggest major regional famines every 10 to 15 years, with minor local shortages more frequently. Others suggest famines were rarer but more devastating when they occurred. What's clear is that famine was a known recurring threat, not an aberration. Medieval people lived with the understanding that any year might be the year when calculations failed, when weather conspired against them, when they'd face the starving time. Recovery from famine took years. Even after good harvest resumed, populations had been depleted. Death migration reduced birth rates during famine years. Agricultural capacity had been damaged, livestock slaughtered, seed grain, eaten land left unplanted. Debt accumulated during famine took years to repay. Children who survived famine often suffered permanent developmental damage from malnutrition, stunted growth. Cognitive impairment weakened health. Famine's effects cascaded forward, shaping communities for generations. And yet, and this is important, most years weren't famine years. Most winters, people's calculations worked. Stores lasted. Spring arrived before starvation hit. The system, for all its precariousness, usually functioned, which made famine years all the more terrifying because they proved that the edge was always there, that survival was never guaranteed. That medieval winter farming was fundamentally a gamble, where sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, you just lost. So as you stand in your cottage in late February looking at inadequate grain supplies and calculating impossible odds, you're facing a choice that millions of medieval people faced. Do you ration more severely and hope you can survive until harvest? Do you start eating seed grain and sacrifice next year? Do you slaughter your cow and lose your milk supply? There are no good answers, only desperate choices and the prayer, literal prayer, because what else do you have that somehow spring will come early, the hungry gap will be shorter than you fear, and your family will make it through one more winter without becoming another tragedy recorded in chronicle margins. It's March. The wind is howling through bare trees and you're standing at the edge of the forest in pre-dawn darkness, with a crude snare made of twisted cord and a stomach twisted with fear. That forest legally belongs to the Lord. The deer in it definitely belong to the Lord. The rabbits probably belong to the Lord. Technically, even the birds belong to the Lord. But your family is hungry, genuinely, desperately hungry, and there's meat walking around in those trees. So you're about to become a poacher, which means you're about to risk brutal punishment for the crime of trying not to starve. Welcome to the dark intersection of medieval game laws, desperation, and the aristocratic obsession with hunting that turned wild animals into property worth killing peasants to protect. Medieval forest law was spectacularly unjust in ways that still make historians angry 8 centuries later. Vast stretches of woodland were designated royal forests or noble hunting preserves, where common people couldn't hunt, couldn't trap, sometimes couldn't even gather fallen wood without permission. These weren't just pristine wilderness. They often included villages, farmland areas people had lived and used for generations. But when a king or lord declared an area forest, it became his private game reserve, and everyone living there became subject to forest law, a separate legal system with its own courts and punishments that were deliberately harsh to protect aristocratic hunting privileges. The punishments for poaching were designed to terrify. Get caught taking a deer, the king's deer as law called them, and you might face hanging, blinding castration or amputation of hands. Lesser offences like trapping rabbits or taking birds might get you fines you couldn't afford, whipping imprisonment, or being placed in stocks for public humiliation. The severity wasn't proportionate to the crime's actual harm. It was about enforcing class hierarchy, reminding peasants that their hunger mattered less than noble recreation. Because that's what hunting was for aristocrats: recreation, sport, entertainment. For them, chasing deer through forest was leisure. For you, it was survival. and the law treated your survival as theft. But here's the thing, people poached anyway. They had to. When your children are starving and rabbits are hopping around woods you can't enter, laws become abstract compared to immediate hunger. Medieval court records are full of poaching cases, so many that it's clear poaching was constant, widespread, a routine practice despite savage punishments. Most poachers never got caught. They knew the woods better than the Lord's gamekeepers knew when and where to set snares, how to move quietly, which animals to target for maximum return versus minimum risk. Rabbits were the primary poaching target because they were abundant, relatively easy to catch, and small enough to hide. You'd set snares along rabbit runs pairs rabbits habitually used using cord or thin wire to create loops that would catch and strangle rabbits as they passed through. Check snares at dawn before gamekeepers made their rounds, grab what you caught, hide it under your clothes and get home before anyone noticed. A rabbit wasn't much meat, maybe 2 pounds, but it was protein fat, something beyond grain and vegetables. For a family living on the edge, 1 rabbit per week could make significant difference. Deer were more dangerous to poach in every sense. They were large, hard to kill quietly, and carried maximum legal penalties. But they were also enormously valuable. A full-grown deer could provide 50 or more pounds of meat, enough to feed a family for weeks if preserved properly. So some desperate or bold poachers targeted deer despite the risks. Methods varied: pit traps, camouflage with branches, boughs and arrows. If you had archery skills, dogs trained to hunt silently at night. Getting a deer carcass out of the forest and butchered without being caught required planning accomplices, storage places where gamekeepers wouldn't look. Birds, partridges, pheasants, wild ducks were technically protected but easier to justify if caught. You could claim you were trapping them because they were eating your crops, which was sometimes legally defensible. Bird snares were simple nooses set in trees or on the ground, baited with grain to attract them. Not high yield, you might catch 1 or 2 birds from a day's worth of snares, but birds were food, and every calorie counted during the hungry gap. Wild boar lived in many forests, and they occupied weird legal territory. They were game animals protected for noble hunting, but they also destroyed crops, making them agricultural pests. Some regions had limited permissions for killing boars that damaged farmland. Others prosecuted it as poaching regardless. Boars were also dangerous adults, could weigh 300 pounds, had tusks that could gore you, and were aggressive when cornered. Hunting boar was risky even without legal consequences. But boar meat was delicious, and a single boar could feed a family for a month. Now here's where it gets socially complex. Poaching wasn't always solo crime. Sometimes it was organized communal villages collectively deciding to poach and sharing the risks and rewards. Everyone stayed silent. No one testified against neighbors. If someone got caught, the village might pool resources to pay fines or support the poacher's family while he served punishment. These were acts of communal resistance against laws everyone recognized as unjust. Historians have found records of systematic poaching operations that lasted years, entire villages defying forest law because they collectively decided that aristocratic hunting privilege mattered less than community survival. Gamekeepers, the Lord's employees tasked with preventing poaching, occupied an impossible position. They were usually recruited from local populations, meaning they were enforcing laws against their own communities. Some took the job seriously, seeing it as secure employment and a chance to exercise authority. Others were quietly complicit, accepting bribes to look the other way, tipping off poachers about patrol schedules, being conveniently absent when poaching was likely happening. A gamekeeper who was too zealous about catching poachers might find himself socially isolated, facing accidents in the woods or dealing with uncooperative witnesses when he tried to prosecute cases. Medieval ballads and folk tales about poachers, particularly Robin Hood stories, captured popular sentiment. Robin Hood, the noble outlaw who poached the king's deer to feed the poor, was fantasy wish fulfillment for communities where poaching was necessity, but also crime. These stories inverted the moral logic of forest law. The poacher became hero, the authority became villain. That these tales were wildly popular tells you how ordinary people felt about game laws. They were illegitimate, unjust, worthy of resistance, even if resistance carried terrible risks. And here's the brutal reality: some people got caught. They got tried, punished, sometimes executed for the crime of being hungry in proximity to meat. Medieval execution records include poachers, men hanged for taking deer, families financially ruined by fines for trapping rabbits, people mutilated as examples to deter others. The system was designed to be harsh enough to make people hesitate, to make hunger compete with fear, to force desperate people to calculate whether feeding their family was worth risking death. Yet poaching continued generation after generation, constant low-level resistance to laws that protected aristocratic leisure over peasant survival. It's a reminder that medieval society wasn't just hierarchical and accepted, it was contested, resisted, subverted daily by people who couldn't openly challenge authority, but could quietly defy it in forests at dawn. So as you crouch in the pre-dawn darkness, checking your rabbit snares, listening for sounds of approaching gamekeepers, you're performing an act that's equal parts survival and resistance. You're stealing by legal definition, but you're also just trying to feed your family. And if you get caught, you'll face punishment designed to terrify others. But if you don't try, if you respect forest law and let your children go hungry, while rabbits multiply in woods you can't enter, then you've let unjust law determine your family's fate. It's not really a choice. It's a calculation forced on you by a system that valued deer more than people. And whatever you decide, whatever happens, you'll know that thousands of other desperate people are making the same calculation in forests across Europe, turning winter hunger into quiet rebellion, one poached rabbit at a time. It's the third week of March, and something wonderful and terrible is happening. The temperature has risen above freezing for 3 days straight. Snow is melting. You can see patches of brown earth appearing through the white. Birds are singing tentatively, confused by the warmth. And you're standing in your cottage doorway with your precious remaining seed grain, your farming tools, your hope and desperation mixed together, thinking, is it time? Can I plant? Should I risk it? Because spring doesn't arrive on a calendar in medieval Europe. It arrives when it wants to, and guessing wrong about when to plant could destroy your entire year's food supply in a single night of frost. Welcome to spring's cruel, false promise, the most psychologically devastating gamble of the medieval agricultural year. After surviving winter's hardships, after rationing through the hungry gap, after making it barely to March, you're confronted with the decision that requires predicting the future. When is it actually safe to plant too early? And a late frost kills your seedlings, wasting precious seed grain and labour. Too late and your crops don't mature before autumn. Frost resulting in failed harvest and famine next winter. There's no weather forecast, no meteorological science. Just tradition, observation, prayer, and the knowledge that people guess wrong all the time with fatal consequences. Medieval farming calendars tried to provide guidance. Folk wisdom said, plant wheat and rye when the soil was workable, usually late March or early April, depending on region. Plant oats and barley in April. Plant beans and peas when you could hold bare soil in your hand comfortably. But these were guidelines, not guarantees, and they varied by location, elevation, soil type, year-to-year weather patterns. What worked perfectly last year might fail this year because weather doesn't repeat precisely. You were reading signs, soil temperature by touch tree, budding patterns, animal behavior, the height of your breath, fog in morning air, trying to discern when winter had truly released its grip. The stakes were absurdly high. Seed grain was finite and precious. If you planted and a hard frost killed everything, you'd lost your seed with nothing to show for it. You could try replanting with your emergency seed reserves, but that was gambling with survival itself. If you hesitated too long trying to be safe, you'd plant in late April or early May, and your crops wouldn't have enough growing season to mature. They'd be vulnerable to early autumn frost, producing weak harvests that barely replenish the seed you'd planted. Either way, too early or too late, you risk catastrophe. March thaws were particularly treacherous because they felt like spring but weren't. Temperatures might rise to 50 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit for several days, melting snow-fooling plants and farmers alike into thinking winter was over. Then a cold snap would return, temperatures dropping below freezing ice, reforming any exposed seedlings getting killed by frost. Medieval chronicles record these weather betrayals. The spring came early, and men planted, then cruel frost destroyed the seeds, and many went hungry. It happened regularly enough that people knew the risk but were desperate enough to gamble anyway. Here's where community knowledge mattered critically. Your village's oldest farmers, people who'd planted crops for 40-50 years, carried weather wisdom in their bones. They remembered the year frost came late in April and killed everything. They remembered the year everyone planted late and summer drought stressed the shortened growing season. They'd developed rules of thumb: don't plant until the hawthorn blooms, wait until you hear the first cuckoo call, watch when wild plants start budding. These weren't scientific, but they encoded generations of observation about local climate patterns, and ignoring elder wisdom often meant learning painful lessons yourself. Religious calendars intersected with planting decisions. Certain saints' days were traditional planting markers: plant peas on St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, plant barley on St. George's Day, April 23rd. These dates had practical logic. They fell in generally appropriate times for those crops in most of England and Northern Europe. But they were also inflexible, and slavish adherence to calendar dates sometimes meant planting too early when weather hadn't actually warmed sufficiently, or too late when conditions were already perfect. You had to balance tradition against observation, religious custom against practical assessment. Soil condition testing was primitive but effective. You'd take a handful of soil and try to form it into a ball. If it formed a solid mud ball, it was too wet working. Wet soil damaged its structure, compacted it, created conditions where seeds would rot rather than germinate. If it crumbled completely, it might be dry enough, but also might still be frozen deeper down where seedlings would try to root. The ideal was soil that formed a ball but crumbled easily when squeezed moist, but not waterlogged, workable but not muddy. You learned this by touch, by experience, by occasionally getting it wrong and suffering the consequences. Now imagine the psychological torture of this decision. You've survived winter barely. You're weak from hunger. Your family is depending on successful harvest, and you have to decide: plant now with risk of frost, or wait with risk of shortened growing season. It's a forced gamble with incomplete information and catastrophic consequences for guessing wrong. And everyone in the village is making similar calculations, watching each other for signals, wondering if they should follow the first brave or desperate farmer who starts ploughing, or wait and be cautious. Some farmers hedged by staggered planting. Plant some fields early, gambling on warm spring. Hold some seed back and plant later if frost hit. This reduced potential losses, but also reduced potential yields. You were spreading seed across longer time periods, rather than optimizing for peak growing conditions. It was insurance trading maximum productivity for reduced risk, a perfectly rational strategy in a world where one bad decision meant starvation. When late frosts did hit after people had planted, the response was communal despair mixed with desperate problem-solving. Could you replant? Did you have spare seed? Would replanted crops have time to mature? Some families replanted immediately, gambling that this was the last frost. Others switched to faster-growing crops like peas or oats, sacrificing preferred wheat for something that might actually produce food. Some gave up on planting entirely, facing the certainty of no harvest this year and the question of how to survive the coming winter without any crop at all. Historians have documented specific killing frost events that triggered regional famines. The spring of 1315 was particularly bad late frosts, followed by excessive rain destroying plantings across northern Europe and initiating the Great Famine. Chronicles describe farmers planting, watching their crops fail, replanting, failing again, exhausting seed supplies and hope simultaneously. The psychological trauma of watching your labour and seed wasted by weather you couldn't control must have been devastating. And yet most years it worked. Most springs farmers guessed right or close enough. They planted seeds, germinated, crops grew, and by summer they were cultivating plants that would feed them through next winter. The system functioned, barely precariously, but it functioned, which made the failure years all the more cruel because they proved that success was never guaranteed, that medieval farming was fundamentally a negotiation with forces you couldn't control or predict. So as you stand there in late March, feeling warmth in the air, but knowing winter's not done with you holding seed grain, and trying to decide if this is the moment you're performing a ritual as old as agriculture itself, reading the earth, gambling on the future, hoping your instincts are right. And whatever you decide, plant now or wait another week, you'll spend the next several nights sleeping badly, waking to check if frost has formed, praying to whichever saint handles agricultural weather, and promising yourself that next year you'll somehow know better, make better choices, guess more accurately, knowing perfectly well that next year you'll stand here again facing the same impossible decision. Hoping spring's promise isn't another beautiful lie. It's a rare January afternoon, and you're walking past the monastery walls when you notice something impossible green. Not the grey-green of winter kale struggling in frozen gardens, but actual vibrant green lettuce growing behind a glass frame tilted toward the pale winter sun. You stop and stare, because this defies everything you know about how plants work. It's January. Nothing grows in January. Except apparently it does if you're a monk with resources knowledge, and the luxury of experimenting with agricultural innovation, while peasants outside the walls are rationing grain and hoping to survive until April. Welcome to medieval horticultural innovation, where monasteries were developing techniques that wouldn't become widespread for centuries, creating winter gardens that were part technology, part magic, and entirely inaccessible to anyone without institutional wealth. Monks had advantages ordinary farmers couldn't dream of. They had time, monastic life was structured around prayer, but between services there were hours for work, study, experimentation. They had literacy, the ability to read classical agricultural texts from Rome, to correspond with other monasteries, to document their experiments and build on accumulated knowledge. They had resources, monasteries controlled vast lands, collected tithes, had income streams that funded projects with no immediate economic return. And they had motivation, religious dietary rules, requiring fish and vegetables on fast days, which in medieval terms meant finding ways to grow food when nature said it was impossible. The hotbed was monastic innovation at its finest. Picture this: you dig a pit about 3 feet deep, fill it with fresh horse manure, lay a straw on top, then add soil. The manure decomposes, generating heat, significant heat, sometimes reaching 140 degrees Fahrenheit in the manure layer. That heat rises through the straw and soil, warming the earth above to temperatures that allow seeds to germinate and grow, even when air temperature is below freezing. On top of this warmed soil, you build a frame and cover it with oiled cloth, or if you're wealthy enough, glass panes. The result is a miniature greenhouse heated by decomposition, a bubble of spring inside winter. Glass was the expensive part, breathtakingly expensive. Window glass in medieval times was luxury reserved for churches and the wealthiest nobility. A glass pane large enough to cover a growing frame might cost more than a peasant family's annual income. Monasteries could afford it because they had institutional wealth and justified it as necessary for maintaining religious dietary obligations. So they built these glass-covered frames, these proto-greenhouses, and grew lettuce, herbs, even early vegetables in the dead of winter while peasants outside couldn't grow anything. Oiled cloth was the poor monastery's alternative linen or canvas soaked in linseed oil to make it translucent and somewhat water-resistant. It didn't transmit light as well as glass, but it was vastly cheaper and still created a protected microclimate. Some monasteries used oiled parchment, which sounds absurd using expensive writing material, as agriculture covering until you realized that for monks growing fresh vegetables for Lenten meals was religiously important enough to justify unusual expenses. The bell jar method was another monastic technique. Individual glass or pottery jars placed over single plants, creating miniature greenhouses. You'd plant lettuce or herbs in autumn, let them grow until winter, then cover each plant with a jar. The jar trapped heat during day, protected against frost at night, and allowed the plant to continue growing slowly through winter. It was the labor-intensive. You needed many jars, had to remove them daily for watering, and air circulation replaced them each evening, but it worked. Monastery gardens in winter sometimes looked like strange sculpture gardens, hundreds of glass jars glinting in weak sunlight, each protecting a plant that shouldn't exist. Cold frames were simpler wooden boxes with angled glass tops built against south-facing walls to capture maximum sunlight. The wall absorbed heat during day and radiated it at night, moderating temperature swings. Combined with the glass top creating greenhouse effect, cold frames could maintain temperatures 10 to 15 degrees warmer than outside air. Not enough to grow summer vegetables, but enough to grow cold hardy greens, to extend the growing season by weeks, on either end to have fresh herbs in February, when everyone else was eating preserved food. Monks documented their techniques in agricultural treatises that circulated among monasteries. Texts with names like De Re Rustica or Liber Ruralium Commodorum contained detailed instructions how deep to dig hotbeds, how much manure to use, which vegetables tolerated, forcing optimal frame angles for winter sun. This was scientific agriculture centuries before the term existed, empirical experimentation documented and shared through literate networks that ordinary farmers had no access to. But here's the class dimension that's impossible to ignore. These innovations remained almost entirely within monastery walls. The knowledge existed, the techniques worked, but they didn't spread to peasant communities because peasants couldn't afford the inputs. Glass was too expensive. Fresh horse manure in quantity required stables full of horses, which meant wealth. The labor for maintaining hotbeds and cold frames competed with survival labor. You couldn't spend hours tending experimental gardens when you were struggling to feed your family from conventional farming. So monastic innovation created a parallel agricultural world where winter vegetables were possible, while peasants continued traditional methods not from ignorance, but from poverty. Some wealthy manors adopted monastic techniques. Noble households wanted fresh herbs for medical purposes, early vegetables for prestigious meals, the status of serving food out of season. They could afford the glass, the labour, the space dedicated to experimental growing. But this only widened the gap. The wealthy ate fresh greens in February, while peasants ate kale and grain porridge, and the technological capacity to change that existed, but remained locked behind economic barriers. Historians still argue about why medieval agricultural innovation didn't diffuse more widely. Some emphasize economic barriers. Peasants couldn't afford the inputs. Others point to social structures that segregated knowledge-keeping innovations within literate institutional contexts. Some suggest that the risks of experimentation were too high for people living on the edge. Trying new techniques might fail, and failure meant starvation. So sticking with proven traditional methods was rational, even if it meant lower yields. What's clear is that medieval Europe had agricultural knowledge far more sophisticated than popular imagination suggests. Monks in the 13th century were growing vegetables in January, using principles that wouldn't be widely applied until the 19th century. They understood soil warming, microclimate creation, season extension, plant forcing. They were doing agricultural science, documenting results, sharing knowledge through networks. The innovation existed. It just didn't reach the people who needed it most. And here's the bitter irony: while monks experimented with winter gardening behind monastery walls, peasants outside those walls were sometimes starving. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 saw mass starvation across Europe. While monasteries maintained their gardens, their fish ponds, their elaborate food production systems. Monasteries provided charity, distributing food to the poor, maintaining almshouses, but the technological gap remained. The people with the knowledge to grow food in winter had sufficient food already. The people who desperately needed to grow food in winter lacked the resources to do so. So as you stand outside the monastery wall looking at that impossible green lettuce growing in January, you're witnessing the medieval equivalent of watching people eat at a restaurant through a window when you're hungry. It's not just food, it's proof that winter scarcity could be reduced, that technology existed to extend growing seasons, that hunger wasn't entirely inevitable. But that technology was gated by wealth, enclosed by institutional walls inaccessible to the vast majority who needed it most. Medieval winter farming had solutions, but solutions without distribution are just provocations, demonstrations that suffering is partly social choice, partly failure to share knowledge and resources across the barriers humans construct. And maybe that's the most frustrating lesson of medieval agriculture. The problems were never purely technical. They were always also about who got access to innovations, who could afford to experiment, who received the benefits of accumulated knowledge. The monks growing winter lettuce weren't villains, they were genuinely trying to solve problems within their context. But the system that gave them glass and leisure, while peasants froze and starved, that system was the real crop failure, the harvest of inequality that no amount of agricultural innovation could fully address. It's the eve of Candlemas, February 2nd, and your village is gathering for the blessing of candles. But you're not really thinking about religious symbolism. You're thinking about weather. Because there's this saying, this folk belief that everyone knows, if Candlemas Day be fair and bright, winter will have another bite. But if Candlemas Day be clouds and rain, winter is gone and won't come again. It sounds like superstition, and maybe it is, but it's also encoded meteorology. Generations of observation about weather patterns compressed into rhyme so people could remember it. And tonight, as you prepare for tomorrow's Mass, you're watching the sky obsessively. Because if the weather law is right, tomorrow's conditions will tell you whether you can risk planting early, or whether you'll be rationing grain until April. Welcome to the intersection of medieval faith weather divination and agricultural desperation. The world where people planted by saints' calendars prayed to specific holy figures for good weather and developed elaborate folk wisdom about predicting seasons because their lives literally depended on guessing right. Modern people dismiss this as superstition, as if medieval farmers were ignorant primitives who thought magic controlled weather. But look closer, and you'll see something more complex practical knowledge wrapped in religious frameworks, because that's how pre-scientific cultures organized information. The beliefs worked often enough to persist, and when they failed, well, everything failed sometimes in medieval agriculture. Saints' days structured the agricultural calendar like a religious almanac. St. Benedict's Day, March 21st for starting spring work. St. George's Day, April 23rd for planting barley. St. John's Day, June 24 for midsummer tasks. These weren't arbitrary, they corresponded roughly to appropriate agricultural timing for northern European climates. Plant barley on April 23rd in medieval England, and you'd usually be within the safe window. The religious framework helped people remember dates in a world without printed calendars, without widespread literacy where most timekeeping was oral and community-based. Each crop had patron saints you'd pray to for successful growth. Saint Isidore the farmer for general agricultural prosperity, Saint Medard for vineyards, Saint Urban for good weather during harvest, Saint Fiacre for vegetable gardens. These weren't just piety, they were psychological coping mechanisms for people with no control over forces that determined their survival. You couldn't make it rain, you couldn't stop frost, you couldn't control anything except your labor and your prayers. So you prayed because what else could you do? And when harvest succeeded, you attributed it to saintly intervention which reinforced the practice. Weather prediction folk wisdom was surprisingly sophisticated when you decode it. Red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in morning, shepherd's warning. That's actually based on real atmospheric optics and weather patterns. Evening red skies often indicate high-pressure systems moving in bringing clear weather. Morning red skies suggest high pressure has passed and low-pressure storms are approaching. Medieval farmers didn't know about pressure systems, but they knew the correlation between sky colour and next-day weather, and they encoded it in rhyme. Animal behaviour predictions were similar. When cats wash behind their ears, rain is coming, probably correlates with humidity changes that cats sense and respond to. When cows lie down in fields, rain is near, might reflect animals seeking sheltered positions when they sense approaching storms. Are these perfectly accurate? No. Do they work better than random guessing? Maybe slightly better than random was worth pursuing when predicting weather mattered so much. Plant phenology, observing when wild plants budded, bloomed, or changed, was practical meteorology disguised as nature watching. When oak leaves are the size of a mouse's ear, it's safe to plant corn, meant wait for soil temperatures to reach appropriate levels, which oak trees were reliably indicating through their growth cycle. Plant above-ground crops during waxing moon, root crops during waning moon might have been superstition, or might have encoded subtle patterns about optimal soil moisture or other factors that correlated loosely with lunar cycles. Historians still argue about how much folk wisdom was genuine pattern, recognition versus confirmation bias. The liturgical calendar served as de facto agricultural guidance. Lent's timing 40 days before Easter, which floated between late March and late April, meant the fast came during the late winter hungry gap, when food was naturally scarce anyway. Religious obligation matched seasonal reality. Easter's arrival signalled spring new life, the approaching end of winter hardship. Whether church authorities deliberately aligned liturgy with agricultural seasons, or whether the alignment emerged organically over centuries is debated, but the effect was the same religious observance structured agricultural time, rogation days. The Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday before Ascension Thursday involved blessing fields, walking parish boundaries praying for good crops. These were agricultural insurance rituals, community events that reinforced social bonds while asking divine favour for harvests. The walking of parish boundaries served practical purposes too, reaffirming land ownership, teaching younger generations about field divisions, maintaining communal knowledge of landscape. Religion and agriculture were inseparable. Weather saints had specific roles. Saint Swithin's Day, July 15th, had folklore claiming that weather on that day would persist for 40 days. Saint Swithin's Day, if it does rain for 40 days, it will remain. This is meteorological nonsense. No single day determines 6 weeks of weather. But it reflected anxiety about summer weather during critical growing periods. If mid-July brought rain that persisted, it could devastate ripening grain. The folk belief encoded the anxiety, giving people a framework to think about weather risks. Divination practices existed in grey areas between folk belief and religious orthodoxy. Some farmers observed first frost dates, first thaw dates, storm patterns, trying to extrapolate seasonal trends. Others consulted weather-sensitive plants like pine cones that opened and closed with humidity changes. The church officially disapproved of a divination predicting the future was God's domain, but tolerated agricultural weather observation because everyone needed food, even clergy. Here's what's psychologically revealing. Medieval people knew their predictions weren't perfectly reliable. Chronicles record surprise storms, unexpected frosts, years when all the signs pointed one way and weather went another. But imperfect prediction was better than no prediction. If your folk wisdom was right, 60% of the time that was valuable, even when it failed the other 40%. You were playing odds using accumulated observation to make slightly better guesses than random chance would allow. And prayer filled the gap between knowledge and control. You did everything practical watched. Weather signs planted according to traditional timing managed fields carefully. But weather and pests and disease were beyond human control, so you prayed. You lit candles on Candlemas. You processed through fields on rogation days. You made offerings to patron saints. Not because you thought prayer guaranteed success, but because it was the only remaining tool you had, and when harvest succeeded, attributing success to divine favour made the randomness of agricultural fortune feel less terrifying. Historians still argue about whether medieval religion helped or hindered agricultural development. Some emphasize that religious frameworks discouraged innovation by attributing outcomes to divine will rather than human technique. Others note that monasteries were centers of agricultural innovation, that religious institutions preserved and transmitted knowledge, that faith provided psychological resilience that helped people endure hardships that might otherwise have broken them. What's undeniable is that religion and agriculture were completely intertwined in medieval consciousness. You didn't just farm, you farmed with God watching, with saints interceding, with your eternal soul, potentially dependent on properly observing religious agricultural customs. The blessing of seeds before planting wasn't just ritual, it was acknowledging that your best efforts might fail without divine favour, that human skill was necessary but insufficient, that survival required both labour and grace. So as you watch the ski on Candlemas Eve, trying to guess whether tomorrow will be fair or foul, trying to decode what it means for spring planting, you're performing an act that's equal parts meteorology, faith, and desperate hope. You're trying to read the future in cloud patterns and folk wisdom. You're preparing to pray to saints whose intercession might or might not help, but certainly can't hurt. And underneath all of it, you're confronting the fundamental uncertainty of agricultural life, that no matter how hard you work, how carefully you plan, how faithfully you pray, sometimes you just don't know what's coming. The weather will do what it does, the harvest will be what it will be. And all you can do is watch for signs, follow tradition, pray sincerely, and hope that this year somehow the combination of skill and luck and divine favour will be enough to see you through. It's late April now, and something miraculous is happening. The world is turning green. Not the desperate frost-bitten green of winter kale clinging to survival, but actual vibrant, enthusiastic green, the green of wheat shoots pushing through, soil of grass erupting in pastures of leaves, unfurling on trees that were bare skeletons just weeks ago. You're standing in your field at dawn watching the sun rise over rows of tiny green shoots, and you're feeling something complex that doesn't have a name. Relief, yes. Gratitude, absolutely. But also exhaustion because you've been fighting for 6 months straight. Fighting cold, fighting hunger, fighting the math that said you might not make it, and only now, only in late April, can you finally exhale and think, we survived, we made it, winter is over. This is the moment medieval farmers lived for, worked toward, prayed for through every frozen morning and hungry evening. The gamble renewed. You planted in March or early April, risking seed grain on the bet that spring was real this time, that frost wouldn't return to kill your seedlings. And it didn't. Or it did, but your plants survived. Or some died, but enough lived. However it happened, you're looking at the first tangible proof that next year's food is growing, that the cycle is continuing, that your family might eat regularly again once harvest arrives. But let's be honest about something modern people often miss. Making it to April didn't mean the struggle was over. It meant you'd survived winter, which was huge, but now came spring and summer labour, ploughing, planting, weeding, managing crops through unpredictable weather. You'd survived the passive suffering of winter rationing, but now came months of active work where exhausted bodies weakened by winter hunger had to perform heavy labour. Many people got sick in spring, their immune systems compromised by months of malnutrition. Suddenly exposed to outdoor work, vulnerable to infections they might have fought off if they'd been better fed. The hungry gap was still real in April. Your stored grain was mostly gone. Your preserved meat exhausted your root vegetables, either eaten or rotted. But fresh food wasn't available yet either. Wheat planted in March wouldn't be ready to harvest until June at the earliest. You were in this twilight zone where winter supplies were depleted, but summer abundance hadn't arrived. Some people foraged more intensely in April, wild greens, early shoots, anything edible emerging with spring growth. Others relied on dairy as cows finally had fresh grass to graze, and began producing more milk. Cheese buttermilk itself, these became critical foods in the gap between stored winter supplies and summer harvest. Here's what medieval sources reveal about spring psychology. This was when hope returned, but cautiously guarded by experience. You'd seen too many springs go wrong. Late frosts killing crops, excessive rain rotting seeds in waterlogged soil droughts that stunted growth. You'd learned not to celebrate too early, not to assume success until grain was actually harvested, threshed, and safely stored. So April's green shoots brought measured hope, the kind that says, maybe this year will be okay, while maintaining readiness for disaster. Children who survived winter often looked different in April, thinner, paler, showing the physical toll of months of insufficient food. But if they'd made it this far, they'd probably survive. Spring meant access to fresh food, to vitamins and nutrients missing from winter diets. You'd see health returning, gradually colour in faces, energy levels rising, the constant colds and illnesses of winter beginning to fade. The village as a whole seemed to wake up, becoming more active, more social, as warming weather and lengthening days allowed activity that had been impossible in winter's darkness. Ploughing dominated early spring work. Fields that had sat frozen through winter now needed breaking, turning over, preparing for planting. If you'd maintained your plough through winter, If your ox or horse had survived on stored fodder, if you still had strength for the back-breaking work of guiding a plough through heavy spring soil, then you could plant. This was when winter's preparation paid off, or failed to pay off. Families who'd maintained equipment and animals could farm effectively. Those who'd slaughtered their draft animals in desperation, who'd let tools deteriorate, who were too weakened by hunger to work, they struggled, falling behind, producing suboptimal plantings that would yield poor harvests that would make next winter even harder. The community dynamic shifted in spring. Winter's intense interdependence, sharing food, helping struggling neighbours, gave way to competitive individual labour. Everyone was planting, everyone was racing to get crops in the ground at optimal times, everyone was focused on their own strips in the common fields. There was still cooperation shared, ploughing communal decisions about field management, but the immediate crisis mentality of winter eased, replaced by the long-term project of growing a successful harvest. And there was this psychological release that came with April, a sense of having passed through something terrible and emerging on the other side. Medieval chronicles occasionally mentioned spring celebrations, not formal holidays, just community gatherings that happened when the worst was clearly past. Shared meals using the first fresh foods of spring. Dancing, singing, the kind of relief celebration that happens when tension that's been building for months suddenly releases. These weren't recorded systematically. Chroniclers cared more about kings and battles than peasant spring parties, but they appear in enough sources to suggest they were common, needed a way for communities to collectively acknowledge survival. But underneath the relief was this awareness you'd do it all again next year. Winter would return, the hungry gap would reappear, the calculations, the rationing, the anxiety about whether supplies would last, all of it was temporary reprieve, not permanent solution. Medieval farmers lived in cycles, annual rhythms that repeated endlessly. Survival this winter meant facing the same challenges next winter, and the winter after that for your entire life, and your children's lives, and their children's lives. It was exhausting in a way that transcended physical tiredness, an existential exhaustion of knowing the struggle never truly ended, only paused. Yet here's what's remarkable: they kept doing it. Generation after generation, medieval farmers faced winter, survived it or didn't, and those who survived started the cycle again. They planted crops in April, knowing full well the risks, the uncertainty, the likelihood that they'd face hunger again next February. They had children, knowing those children would inherit the same precarious existence. They invested labour in long-term projects, clearing new land, building better storage, improving tools, despite knowing that no amount of improvement could eliminate fundamental risks. Historians describe this as resilience, but it was more than that. It was stubborn refusal to give up despite overwhelming evidence that life was hard and would remain hard. It was finding meaning in the daily work, in the community bonds, in the small victories of a good harvest or a mild winter. It was the knowledge that life, even difficult life, was worth living, that spring's green shoots were beautiful, even when you knew next winter was coming, that children laughing was valuable, even if those children would someday face the same hardships. And maybe that's the real lesson of medieval winter farming. It wasn't about conquering nature or achieving security. Those things weren't possible with their technology, their resources, their understanding. It was about endurance, about continuing despite uncertainty, about finding ways to survive, and even find moments of joy in a world that was fundamentally precarious. They were tougher than us, not because they were physically stronger, though they probably were, but because they lived with constant uncertainty and kept going anyway. So as you stand in your field in late April, watching those green wheat shoots catching morning light, you're not thinking about harvest yet. You're not calculating yields or planning storage. You're just standing there, feeling warmth on your face, watching things grow and thinking, we made it. Winter tried to kill us, and we're still here. And for now, in this moment, that's enough. The future will come. Next winter will arrive. There will be new calculations, new struggles, new gambles against cold and hunger. But right now, the world is green, spring is real, and you've earned the right to simply stand in your field and breathe and feel grateful for the stubborn fact of survival. The story repeats every year, endless cycles of hardship and renewal, and you're part of it, have always been part of it, will continue being part of it, for as long as the earth turns and seasons change and human beings refuse to give up on the difficult, beautiful, terrible work of staying alive. Now let's wind down together. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel your shoulders relax. The medieval world we've been exploring is gone now. Its hardships, its uncertainties, its constant gamble with survival. You're here now, warm and safe, with food systems so reliable you can take them for granted. Those farmers who stood in frozen fields, who rationed grain with shaking hands, who prayed over seeds planted in uncertain ground, they're long gone. But something of their resilience remains encoded in the agricultural knowledge we still use in the crops. We still grow in the understanding that survival sometimes requires enduring what seems unendurable. Their winters are over. Their hungry gaps have closed. Their children's children's children eventually found easier lives technologies that made survival less precarious systems that replaced individual struggle with collective security. The story moved forward as stories do, and now as you lie here in comfort, they couldn't have imagined you carry a small piece of their memory, the knowledge of what it took to survive winter when survival was never guaranteed. Let that knowledge settle gently. Let the images of frozen fields and spring's green shoots fade into comfortable darkness. Breathe slowly. The past is past. The present is warm. And tomorrow when you wake, you'll remember that resilience isn't just about physical strength. It's about the quiet decision made again and again across centuries and seasons to keep going, even when the math looks bad and winter feels endless. That decision, that stubborn human refusal to give up, is the real harvest of all those medieval winters. And it's yours now, a gift from people who faced the cold and somehow impossibly survived. Sleep well. The story ends here, but spring always returns. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.